Imagine standing on a hillside, somewhere in what is now the state of Washington. It's quiet. Maybe you hear wind, maybe a few birds, and then in the distance you hear something else. A sound like thunder that never stops rolling. You turn, and what you see doesn't make sense at first. A wall of water taller than a 10-story building, moving faster than any river has ever moved, faster than a car on a highway, ripping across the land like the earth itself had opened up and decided to rearrange itself. This isn't fiction. This isn't some Hollywood disaster movie. This happened right here, on this continent, thousands of years ago. And by the time the water finally slowed down, it had scoured away hundreds of feet of solid rock, carved canyons in a matter of days that should have taken rivers millions of years to create, and left behind a landscape so strange, so seemingly impossible, that when scientists first saw it, they refused to believe what their own eyes were telling them. Tonight, we're going back to that moment, back to the Ice Age, when much of North America lay buried under glaciers thick enough to bury mountains. Back to a lake, a single lake, that held more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, dammed up behind nothing more than a wall of ice. And we're going to slowly, gently trace what happened when that wall of ice finally gave way. If you're settling in to fall asleep right now, that's exactly why I made this. So before we drift into the story, go ahead and subscribe maybe, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love checking back later and seeing the same video playing at midnight in Tokyo, at sunset in Lisbon, at dawn in Toronto, all at once. It's a strange, comforting thought, all of us scattered across the globe, drifting off to the same ancient flood story. And if you'd rather listen without any music, without any of the little audio flourishes, just my voice easing you into sleep, you can find an ad-free, music-free version of this show on Spotify. The link is down in the description if you want to follow along there instead. Now, back to the Ice Age. Picture glaciers so massive they reshaped the shoreline of an entire continent, rivers of ice creeping down from what is now Canada, grinding across the land, damming up valleys that had never been dammed before. In one of those valleys, a lake began to form. Geologists would later name it Glacial Lake Missoula, and at its largest it may have held as much water as some of the largest lakes on Earth today. All of it held back by nothing more than ice. Ice is strange stuff. It looks solid, permanent, unshakable, but under enough pressure over enough time it fails. And when an ice dam holding back a lake the size of a modern state finally fails, it doesn't fail slowly. It doesn't trickle, it bursts. And what follows is one of the most catastrophic floods this continent has ever known, releasing more water in a matter of days than most rivers release in centuries. What's coming in this story is a journey through deep time. Glaciers that reshaped the map, a lake that shouldn't have existed. A flood, or maybe dozens of floods, that carved out canyons, waterfalls, and strange rippled landscapes, still visible from the sky today. And a decades-long scientific battle over whether any of this was even possible. A battle that nearly destroyed one geologist's career simply because he dared to believe what the land was telling him. So get comfortable, let your eyes grow heavy if they want to. We're drifting back now, slowly to a quieter world, right before it exploded into chaos. Back to the ice, the lake, and the flood that rewrote half a continent. Let's drift back further now, past the flood, past the lake, past even the ice dam itself, to the slow, patient forces that built the stage for all of it. Because to understand how a wall of water could reshape half a continent, you first have to understand the world that made such a thing possible. A world locked in ice for longer than human memory can hold. Geologists call this the Pleistocene epoch. It began roughly 2.5 million years ago, and it wasn't one long winter. Not exactly. It was more like a slow, uneven breathing. The planet's climate rose and fell across tens of thousands of years, swinging between bitter cold glacial periods and warmer interglacial ones. Ice sheets grew across the northern continents, then shrank, then grew again and again in cycles so long that a single one could outlast every civilization that would ever exist. We happen to be telling this story from somewhere near the tail end of the most recent deep cold phase, a time when ice didn't just dust the mountaintops. It buried them. Picture North America during one of these cold peaks. Almost a third of the continent's land lay hidden beneath ice, some of it more than a mile thick. In the east, an enormous ice sheet called the Laurentide spread down from what is now Canada, smothering the Great Lakes region, pressing as far south as modern-day Ohio and Indiana. But our story tonight isn't about that ice sheet. It's about its quieter cousin, far to the west, one that gets far less attention but caused, arguably, a far stranger catastrophe. This was the Cordilleran ice sheet, and it belongs almost entirely to the Pacific Northwest. Imagine a slow, creeping mass of ice forming over the mountains of British Columbia, thickening year after year as snow fell and never fully melted, compacting into ice under its own crushing weight. Over centuries, this ice sheet grew heavy enough, tall enough, patient enough to start moving. Not like a river, not fast, but with the same relentless logic. Ice flows downhill following the paths of least resistance, and in this part of the world, that meant flowing straight into the river valleys carved out long before the ice ever arrived. These moving tongues of ice are called glacial lobes, and you can think of them almost like fingers reaching south from one great frozen hand. Each lobe pushed down into a different valley, grinding, scraping, reshaping the land beneath it. One of these lobes, known today as the Purcell Trench Lobe, crept south into what is now northern Idaho, sliding directly into the path of the Clark Fork River Valley. And that, quietly, almost gently, is where our story begins to take shape. Because a glacial lobe sliding into a river valley doesn't just melt away and vanish. Sometimes, if conditions align just right, it plugs the valley completely, like a cork forced into the neck of a bottle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's slow down and imagine the broader landscape first, the ancient version of a region we now casually pass through on interstate highways without a second thought. Picture the land encompassing what we now call Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Long before highways, before towns, before any human eyes had ever seen this land, it consisted of river valleys, forested slopes, and wide-open basins shaped by millions of years of slower, quieter geological processes, volcanic eruptions laying down thick sheets of basalt rock, ancient rivers meandering across floodplains, gradual uplift lifting mountains skyward one imperceptible inch at a time. This was a landscape built by patience, shaped over unimaginable stretches of time by forces so slow that in a single human lifetime you would notice almost nothing changing at all. And then the ice arrived and everything sped up. To understand why the ice grew so massive in this particular region, you have to think about the climate conditions of the time. Cold, certainly, but also crucially wet. Moist air rolling in from the Pacific Ocean met the mountain ranges of the Pacific Northwest and dropped enormous quantities of snow, year after year, century after century. In a warmer climate, that snow might have simply melted away each summer. But during the depths of this glacial period, summers were short and cool, not warm enough to undo what winter had built. So the snow accumulated, layer upon layer, compacting under its own weight, transforming gradually into dense, ancient ice. This is how ice sheets are born, not through some sudden dramatic event, but through thousands of years of snow simply refusing to fully melt. Add up enough of those years, and you get ice thick enough to bury entire mountain ranges, ice heavy enough to flow like a very, very slow river, spreading outward, southward, filling valleys that had never known anything like it. By the time the Cordilleran ice sheet reached its greatest extent, somewhere around 15 to 20,000 years ago, though the timing likely varied by region and remains something scientists continue refining, it may have covered most of British Columbia and stretched down into what is now Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Some estimates suggest it stood over a mile thick in certain places, an almost incomprehensible mass of frozen water pressing down on the land beneath it, slowly, quietly reshaping everything it touched. And somewhere within this vast frozen landscape, one particular lobe of ice was creeping toward a very particular valley in northern Idaho, a valley where a river once flowed freely toward the Pacific. A valley about to be blocked, sealed, transformed into something the land had never experienced before. Because when that glacial lobe finally reached the valley floor, it wouldn't simply pass through. It would settle in like an enormous frozen plug, hundreds of feet tall, spanning the entire width of the valley, stopping the river dead in its path. And behind that plug, water would begin to gather, slowly at first, almost peacefully, a lake forming in a place no lake had ever existed before, filling higher and higher, year after year, decade after decade, utterly unaware of just how much pressure was quietly building behind that wall of ice. None of this looked dangerous yet. If you had stood on a nearby ridge and watched it happen across a human lifetime, you might have simply seen a valley slowly flooding, a new lake taking shape amid the mountains. Nothing more dramatic than that. But ice, as we'll come to see, is a patient and unreliable jailer. And what it was quietly holding back would soon become one of the largest lakes glacial North America had ever known. A lake with a name, a lake with a story, a lake that geologists would later call Glacial Lake Missoula. So the ice came creeping down from the north. That single finger of the Cordilleran ice sheet, the Purcell Trench lobe sliding inch by inch, year by year, into the valley of the Clark Fork River. And when it arrived, it didn't just cross the river and keep going. It stopped, it settled, it stayed. Imagine what that actually means for a moment. The Clark Fork River was a major waterway, draining a vast stretch of what is now western Montana, carrying snowmelt and rain downstream toward Lake Pendore and eventually out to the Pacific. It had flowed through that valley for millions of years. And then one day, geologically speaking, it couldn't anymore. A wall of ice, hundreds of feet thick, had simply plugged the gap. Rivers don't just stop because something blocks them. Water keeps coming, rain falls, snow melts, tributaries feed into the main channel, and all of that water has to go somewhere. When it can't go forward, it goes up, it rises, and that is exactly what happened behind that ice dam. Water began to pool, slowly at first, spreading across the valley floor, rising inch by inch, foot by foot, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The Clark Fork kept bringing water down from the mountains, and that water had nowhere to go but up. This is how Glacial Lake Missoula was born, not in a single dramatic moment, but through the slow, patient accumulation of water behind an icy barrier. A lake that had never existed before, forming in a place where no lake had ever been, rising steadily in a landscape that had been dry land for ages. Now, it's hard to overstate just how massive this lake became. When it finally reached its maximum extent, Glacial Lake Missoula stretched for roughly 200 miles, reaching from the ice dam in northern Idaho eastward, across western Montana, fingers of water extending up into mountain valleys that had never known standing water. At its widest, it may have been 60 miles across. Think about that for a moment. A body of water roughly the size of one of the modern Great Lakes, Lake Erie perhaps, or Lake Ontario, sitting high in the mountains of Montana, held back not by bedrock, not by earth, but by ice. The depth was equally staggering. Near the ice dam itself, where the valley floor dropped to its lowest point, the lake may have reached depths of around 2,000 feet. That's not a typo. 2,000 feet of water pressing against a wall of frozen ice. To put that in perspective, imagine standing at the bottom of that lake and looking up. You would see nearly half a mile of dark, cold water above you, a column of pressure so immense that it's difficult to truly comprehend. The total volume of water contained in Glacial Lake Missoula, at its peak, has been estimated at roughly 500 cubic miles. That's more than the combined volume of Lakes Erie and Ontario. All of it, every drop, held back by ice. And here's something remarkable. You can still see the evidence of this lake today if you know where to look. Drive through western Montana, glance up at the mountainsides surrounding the Missoula Valley, and you might notice faint horizontal lines etched into the rock and soil. These are ancient shorelines, wave-cut terraces left behind by the waters of Glacial Lake Missoula as it sat there, sometimes for decades, sometimes perhaps for centuries, slowly rising, slowly falling, as the balance between incoming water and the ice dam's integrity shifted. There are multiple shoreline levels visible on some mountainsides, marking different stages of the lake's history. Some stand out clearly, bold horizontal bands cutting across slopes that now rise thousands of feet above the valley floor. Others are more subtle, requiring a trained eye to spot faint traces of a shoreline that existed for perhaps only a few years before the water rose higher or dropped away. These terraces are like bathtub rings on a geological scale, quiet proof that water once stood where now there are only trees and towns and highways. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Glacial Lake Missoula is not its size, not its depth, but its calm. Because this lake, this enormous inland sea perched in the mountains, was always temporary. It existed in a state of precarious equilibrium. Water pressing outward against ice holding firm against water, and neither side able to maintain that balance forever. When the lake was full, when it had risen to its maximum level, the pressure against that ice dam must have been almost unimaginable. Hundreds of cubic miles of water weighing billions upon billions of tons, pushing against a barrier of ice that, while massive, was ultimately subject to the same physical laws as any other material. Ice floats, ice cracks, ice melts, and ice under enough pressure can lift. But for long stretches of time, perhaps decades, perhaps longer, the dam held, and the lake simply sat there, surface waters rippling in mountain breezes, icebergs carving from glaciers along the shoreline, and drifting slowly across the surface. The shoreline creeping higher up the mountain slopes as more and more water accumulated. An entire ecosystem forming in and around the water. Plants, fish, maybe even migrating birds stopping briefly on this strange high-altitude lake that shouldn't have been there at all. It must have been eerily peaceful. A vast, cold lake nestled among snow-capped peaks, reflecting the sky, glinting in the brief northern summers, still and quiet in the long winters when ice might have formed across its surface. If you had been there, standing on its shore, you would have had no way of knowing what was coming. No sense that this serene body of water was in fact a catastrophe in slow motion. That the calm surface represented thousands of years of accumulated pressure, building, waiting, searching for any weakness in the wall of ice that held it back. And the ice dam, for its part, was not just sitting there passively. It was changing constantly, growing thicker as more ice flowed down from the north, thinning as its base slowly melted under the pressure and geothermal heat from below, cracking and shifting as temperatures fluctuated. The relationship between the lake and the dam was dynamic, alive with tension, even if everything looked perfectly still from the outside. This is the nature of glacial landscapes. They appear frozen, static, unchanging. But that's an illusion created by our short human lifetimes. On geological timescales, ice is fluid, restless, and deeply unpredictable. The dam that held back Lake Missoula was not a permanent fixture of the landscape. It was a temporary arrangement of frozen water, and like all temporary things, it was destined to end. But we're not quite there yet. Before we can understand how the dam broke, how the lake emptied, how a wall of water managed to carve its way across half a continent, we need to understand something more fundamental about ice itself, about its strange physics, its hidden vulnerabilities, and the precise mechanics of how an ice dam fails. So let's talk about ice, not the thin sheets that form on a winter puddle or the cubes you might drop into a glass, but glacial ice. Hundreds of feet of it, compressed by its own weight, creeping and flowing like something almost alive. To understand how an ice dam can hold back a lake the size of Lake Erie, and more importantly, how it inevitably fails, you have to understand what ice actually is at a structural level. Glacial ice isn't rigid. It's not like concrete or steel or the stone walls of a modern reservoir. It behaves in many ways like an incredibly slow, incredibly viscous fluid. Under immense pressure, the crystals of ice deform, they slide past one another, they stretch and bend and flow. This is how glaciers move in the first place. The weight of accumulated snowfall presses down, the ice deforms under that weight, and gravity pulls it downhill. The Purcell Trench lobe, the finger of ice that plugged the Clark Fork Valley, had flowed down from the north through exactly this process, and even after it stopped advancing and settled across the valley, it was still flowing internally, still shifting, still adjusting to the stresses acting upon it. When water began to pool behind this barrier, a new set of stresses came into play. Water is heavy. A cubic foot of fresh water weighs about 62 pounds. A cubic yard weighs nearly 1,700 pounds. And Glacial Lake Missoula, at its maximum depth of around 2,000 feet, contained a column of water that pressed against the ice dam with a force that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. We're talking about millions of pounds of pressure per square foot at the base of that dam. And this pressure wasn't just pushing horizontally against the ice. It was omnidirectional. Water pressure acts equally in all directions, which meant it was pushing down on the valley floor, pushing outward against the valley walls, and crucially pushing underneath the ice dam itself. This is where the physics starts to get really interesting and really unstable. Because ice, for all its apparent solidity, floats. It floats because it is less dense than liquid water. This is a quirk of physics that most substances don't share, but it's absolutely essential to how this story unfolds. When water presses against the base of an ice dam, it's pressing against the bottom of a floating body. And if the water pressure exceeds the weight of the ice above it, that ice will try to float. It will try to lift. Now, initially, the dam was thick enough and heavy enough to resist this lifting force. The weight of all that ice pressing down kept the dam anchored to the valley floor. But as the lake deepened, as more and more water accumulated behind the barrier, the pressure at the bottom increased steadily. And something else was happening simultaneously. The base of the ice dam was slowly melting. This melting came from two sources. First, the water of Lake Missoula itself, which, even though it was glacial meltwater and likely near freezing, was still liquid. Liquid water, even at temperatures just above freezing, transfers heat far more efficiently than air. It was in constant contact with the ice, slowly eating away at it from the upstream side. Second, and more significantly, geothermal heat from the Earth's crust was warming the base of the glacier from below. This is happening beneath every glacier on Earth right now. A thin film of meltwater forms at the interface between the ice and the bedrock, acting as a lubricant that allows the glacier to slide. For the Purcell Trench lobe, this basal melting was slowly thinning the dam from underneath, reducing its weight, reducing its ability to resist the growing pressure of the lake behind it. We actually see this process playing out on a much smaller scale today. In Iceland, in Alaska, in the Himalayas, modern ice dams form regularly when glaciers advance across river valleys, and when they do, they create temporary lakes that fill and drain in cycles. These draining events are called jökulhlaups, an Icelandic term that translates roughly to glacial outburst floods. Modern jökulhlaups are terrifying enough. They can release millions of cubic meters of water in a matter of hours, sending flood waves roaring down valleys, sweeping away everything in their path. But they are mere ripples compared to what was building behind the ice dam at Lake Missoula. Still, they provide us with a working model, an observable analogue for understanding the mechanics of how an ice dam fails. The process typically begins slowly, almost imperceptibly. As water pressure builds behind the dam, it starts to find or create pathways through the ice. Not through the solid mass of the glacier itself, at least not at first, but along existing weaknesses, cracks, crevasses, the boundaries between layers of ice that formed in different years, the interface between the ice and the valley walls. Water seeps into these tiny gaps, and because water is incompressible and under enormous pressure, it forces them open. Just a tiny bit at first, fractions of an inch, but that's enough. Once water enters a crack, it does something remarkable. It melts, not dramatically, not visibly, but through the physics of pressure melting. When water is forced into a confined space under high pressure, its freezing point actually drops slightly. This means the water remains liquid at temperatures where it would normally freeze solid. And as it flows through the crack, it transfers heat from the lake to the surrounding ice, gradually widening the pathway, creating a positive feedback loop. More water flows through, more heat is transferred, the crack widens, even more water flows through. This is how the tunnel begins. A tiny vein of water working its way through the body of the ice dam, growing slowly but relentlessly. From the surface of the lake, from the shore, none of this would be visible. The water level might drop slightly, imperceptibly, as some water finds its way through the dam. But the lake is so enormous, containing so many cubic miles of water, that this initial draining would be completely undetectable to any observer. Underneath and inside the dam, though, the process is accelerating. The tunnel grows wider. More water flows through with increasing speed. The flow itself generates friction, which generates heat, which melts more ice, which widens the tunnel further. The dam, which has held firm for decades, perhaps centuries, is being hollowed out from within. Its structural integrity, already compromised by basal melting and internal deformation, begins to fail in earnest. And then comes the tipping point. The moment when the water pressure from the lake finally exceeds the weight of the remaining ice. The dam doesn't just crack, it lifts. The entire barrier, or at least a significant portion of it, detaches from the valley floor and begins to float, tilting, shifting, breaking apart as billions of tons of water surge underneath it, through it, around it. This is the moment. The transition from a stable, if precarious, equilibrium to catastrophic failure. It doesn't take long. Once the dam begins to lift, once the tunnel through the ice reaches a critical size, the process becomes self-reinforcing and unstoppable. More water flows, more ice melts, more of the dam loses its footing, and within hours, perhaps even less, the entire structure collapses. The lake, that vast, cold, patient body of water that has been accumulating for so long, finally finds its way out, all at once. And so it begins, not with a sound, not with a dramatic crack echoing across the wilderness, but with a slow, deep, almost silent shift. The ice dam, that massive plug of frozen water that has held back a sea for decades, perhaps centuries, loses its grip on the bedrock below. It lifts, it tilts, and in that singular invisible moment, the equilibrium that has contained over 500 cubic miles of water shatters completely. Imagine the scene for a moment if you can. Glacial Lake Missoula stretches out for miles in every direction, its surface rippling quietly under a pale, cold sky. Along its shores, ancient ice margins creak and groan. The water is deep, staggeringly deep, pushing 2,000 feet in the basin near the dam. For years, this water has been patiently testing the barrier, probing it, seeping into its hidden fractures, and now, finally, the barrier yields. The first rush of water escaping underneath the lifting ice is almost gentle by the standards of what follows. It surges through the expanding tunnel that has been quietly carving itself through the dam, a vein of high-pressure meltwater that suddenly finds itself with room to grow. And grow it does, exponentially. As the water flows faster, it generates friction against the ice. That friction generates heat. The heat melts more ice, widening the tunnel, which allows more water to pour through, which generates more friction, more heat, more melting. It is a runaway feedback loop, a chain reaction that once started cannot be stopped by any force on Earth. Within minutes the trickle becomes a torrent. Within hours the torrent becomes something that defies our ordinary understanding of water. The ice dam, hollowed out and undermined, begins to break apart into massive blocks, some of them the size of small towns. These floating fortresses of ice are swept up by the surging water or shoved violently aside as the lake violently reclaims its ancient pathway. The Clark Fork River, that humble, peaceful stream that had been drowned for so long beneath the depths of the lake, suddenly reappears as a catastrophic drain. Picture a bathtub the size of a small sea, and someone has suddenly pulled the stopper. Except the stopper is 2,000 feet of collapsing glacier, and the drain is an entire mountain valley. The water doesn't just flow out, it explodes outward. The surface of Lake Missoula begins to drop, slowly at first, then faster and faster. We are talking about a lake containing over 500 cubic miles of water, and an astonishing amount of it is going to empty in a matter of days. Some estimates suggest that at the peak of the flood, the discharge rate was equivalent to more than 10 times the combined flow of every river on the planet today. Let that sink in for a moment. Every river. The Amazon, the Congo, the Mississippi, the Nile, the Yangtze, all of them flowing together, multiplied by 10. That is the volume of water we are dealing with. The sound of this event is something almost impossible to comprehend. A deep, low, bone-shaking rumble that would have been felt in the ground long before it reached any ear. The cracking of the ice dam would produce a shock wave, a thunderous boom rolling across the landscape, followed by the continuous deafening roar of 1 billion tons of water cascading through a confined valley. It is the sound of the world coming apart at the seams. But here is the most haunting aspect of this scene. There was no one there to hear it. No human ear caught the thunder of the breaking dam. No human eye witnessed the collapse of the ice or the first terrifying surge of the floodwaters. This was a world of ice, rock, and sky, populated perhaps by distant ancestors of ours, clinging to warmer refuges far to the south, but empty of witnesses in the icy expanse of the northern latitudes. The flood roared into an emptiness. It was an event of almost planetary significance, and it happened in an eerie, absolute silence as far as any conscious observer was concerned. So how do we know any of this? How can geologists reconstruct in such vivid detail the moment an ice dam broke more than 15,000 years ago? The answer is written in the earth itself, in a language of sediment, stone, and carved topography. We understand the physics of ice and water, and we can observe the behaviour of modern glaciers that form and break ice dams in places like Iceland. These modern events, those yokel hops, give us a working model for the mechanics of failure, a scaled-down version of the Missoula flood. But the evidence for the specific sequence of events is carved into the landscape of Montana, Idaho, and Washington. Geologists can trace the shorelines of Lake Missoula on the hillsides, ancient strand lines that mark the water level like a ring around a bathtub. By calculating how far apart these lines are and how quickly the water must have dropped, they can estimate the rate at which the lake drained. They can look at the enormous boulders that were ripped from the dam site and carried miles downstream, their positions revealing the staggering power of the current. They can study the giant current ripples, the same kind of ripples you might see on a stream bed, but scaled up to the size of houses, their spacing and height revealing the depth and velocity of the water that formed them. And they can examine the layers of sediment left behind, thick deposits of gravel and mud that tell the story of a massive, short-lived flood event, not a slow, gradual process of erosion. By combining all of these lines of evidence, geologists have built a remarkably detailed picture of what happened on that day, a day that no one saw, but that the land remembers. The lake empties, the water, now a roaring, churning cauldron of mud, ice, and shattered rock, surges out of the Clark Fork Valley and begins its furious journey westward. It is not a river anymore. It is not even a flood in any sense we might recognize from modern experience. It is a cataclysm, a liquid avalanche moving at highway speeds, carrying with it the power to reshape an entire continent. And it is heading straight for the heart of the Pacific Northwest. So what does a wall of water actually look like when it is carrying the combined flow of every river on Earth, multiplied by 10? It is a question that almost defies the limits of imagination. Our minds are built to understand the gentle flow of a creek, the steady current of a familiar river, maybe even the angry swell of a seasonal flood. But this was something else entirely. This was water behaving in ways that seemed to violate the very nature of the substance, transforming from something that sustains life into a geological force capable of shredding the skin of a continent. As the floodwaters surged out of the Clark Fork Valley and poured into the broader landscapes of northern Idaho and eastern Washington, they were not a single uniform wave. The leading edge of the flood would have been a turbulent, foaming front, a churning mixture of water, mud, pulverized rock, and shattered ice blocks. It moved fast. Scientific estimates place the velocity of the floodwaters at somewhere between 30 and 50 miles per hour across the flat expanses, and even faster where the terrain narrowed and forced the water through confined valleys. Picture a wall of water, perhaps hundreds of feet tall, advancing across the landscape faster than a person could run, faster than a horse could gallop. It was less like a flood and more like a liquid avalanche, a vast sliding sheet of destruction that left nothing unchanged in its wake. The flow rates are where the true scale of this event becomes almost impossible to grasp. At its peak, the discharge is estimated to have reached around 10 million cubic meters per second. Some calculations push that number even higher, perhaps closer to 20 million. To put that in perspective, the Amazon River, the largest river on the planet by volume, discharges about 200,000 cubic meters per second. The Mississippi, even at its most swollen, manages around 50,000. The Missoula flood was releasing more water in a single second than the Amazon pushes out in a full minute. It was more water than all the world's rivers combined, flowing past a single point, moment after moment, hour after hour, and this was not a brief spasm. The flood maintained these staggering volumes for days. Because Lake Missoula held over 500 cubic miles of water, and because the drain was essentially an open wound in the landscape, the lake emptied with astonishing speed. Current models suggest that the majority of the water, perhaps 60 to 70% of the total volume, rushed out in the first 2 to 4 days. Imagine that. A body of water stretching for miles, containing more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined, draining in roughly the same time it takes to enjoy a long weekend. By the end of a week, the lake would have been nearly empty, its shorelines dropping hundreds of feet, leaving vast mudflats and stranded icebergs in its wake. But the water that left the lake was not the same as the water that had been sitting peacefully in it. As the flood roared across the terrain, it picked up everything in its path. It gouged into hillsides, ripping loose tons of soil, gravel, and solid rock. It swallowed entire forests, snapping ancient pines like matchsticks and tumbling them into the churning mass. The water grew thicker, heavier, almost viscous with sediment, becoming a dense, abrasive slurry that could strip bedrock bare. This is what geologists call a hyperconcentrated flow, a fluid so loaded with debris that it behaves more like wet concrete than clear water, and it is this quality that gave the flood its most terrifying ability, the power to move boulders. We are not talking about rocks the size of basketballs or even cars. We are talking about massive pieces of granite and basalt, some weighing thousands of tons, ripped from their bedrock homes and carried for miles like pebbles in a stream. The physics here is straightforward but staggering. When water moves at 40 or 50 miles per hour, its kinetic energy scales up in a hurry. A cubic meter of water weighs 1,000 kilograms. When billions of cubic meters are moving at highway speeds, the cumulative force is enough to lift, tumble, and transport almost anything. The flood could easily pluck enormous blocks of stone from canyon walls, or tear them from the remains of the disintegrating ice dam, carrying them along in the current until the water slowed enough to drop them in fields far from where they started. Now, it is important to pause here and acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. These numbers, the flow rates, the velocities, the timescales, are estimates. They are the best calculations that geologists and hydrologists can make based on the physical evidence left behind, but they come with inherent uncertainty. We cannot simply build a scale model of the Missoula flood in a laboratory and watch it play out. The equations that govern fluid dynamics work well enough for modern rivers and controlled experiments, but applying them to an event of this magnitude requires extrapolation, assumption, and a degree of educated guesswork. Different researchers, using slightly different variables, or interpreting the evidence in different ways, arrive at somewhat different numbers. Some think the peak discharge was lower, perhaps 6 or 7 million cubic meters per second. Others argue it could have been significantly higher. The exact speed of the advancing front, the precise timeline of the draining, the depth of the water at any given location. These details remain subjects of ongoing research and occasional debate. What is not in dispute is the overall scale of the event. Even the most conservative estimates describe a flood of almost unimaginable power, a phenomenon that sits so far outside the range of modern human experience that our language struggles to capture it. The floodwaters, having gathered their terrible momentum, were now surging across the landscape of eastern Washington, spreading out over the plains and slamming into ridges, searching for every available path to the southwest. The wall of water was not a single wave that crashed and receded. It was a sustained, brutal assault, a days-long torrent that kept coming and coming, fed by the enormous volume of the draining lake. The land had never experienced anything like it. The soil, the rock, the very topography of the region were about to be rewritten by the single most powerful flood in the history of the continent. And what that flood did to the terrain, the scars it carved and the features it created, would remain as silent, enduring proof of its passage for thousands of years, waiting for a geologist with an unconventional idea to finally read them correctly. When the floodwaters poured across eastern Washington, they did not simply wet the ground and move on. They tore the skin off the earth. What had been a landscape of rolling plains, thick soil and gentle valleys was about to be subjected to a level of violence that is difficult to comprehend. And what was left behind was so strange, so utterly unlike anything else on the planet, that early settlers and surveyors didn't know what to make of it. They looked at the scarred, pitted, bare rock terrain and gave it a name that stuck. They called them the Scablands. The name fits, in a deeply evocative way. Scabs are what form over wounds, rough and jagged patches where the underlying tissue has been laid bare and is slowly trying to heal, and that is exactly what this landscape looks like. A vast wounded expanse of exposed dark rock, interspersed with islands of intact, soil-covered prairie. But to understand how a landscape gets scabbed, you have to imagine what happens when the equivalent of a liquid avalanche, moving at highway speeds and carrying millions of tons of abrasive sediment, slams into terrain that has spent tens of thousands of years quietly building up a layer of fertile, wind-blown soil called loess. This soil was deep, in some places 100 feet or more of rich, silty earth that supported grasslands and ecosystems. To the flood it was nothing. It was mere tissue paper stretched across solid rock. As the hyperconcentrated flow hit these plains, it acted like the world's largest sandblaster, but instead of sand, it was using gravel, boulders and pulverized rock, suspended in a slurry of mud and water moving at 40 or 50 miles per hour. The soil was ripped away in vast continuous sheets, stripped, sheared, pulverized and churned into the flood itself, adding to the abrasive slurry and making the water even more effective at carving the rock beneath. In a matter of hours, perhaps just a single day in some areas, thousands of years of accumulated topsoil was erased, swept away downstream, leaving nothing but the naked dark basalt beneath. The basalt itself was not a uniform solid sheet. It had been laid down millions of years earlier by massive volcanic eruptions, layer upon layer of lava that cooled and contracted, forming distinct columns and fractures. When the floodwaters stripped away the protective soil and attacked this jointed rock, they found weaknesses. Water under immense pressure was forced into the cracks and joints of the basalt. This process, called plucking, is uniquely devastating. The flood didn't just grind the rock down from the top, it hydraulic jacked it apart from the inside. The pressure of the water forced into the fractures, loosened enormous blocks of basalt, some the size of houses, which were then ripped from the bedrock and tumbled into the torrent to become battering rams against the next obstacle. Where the flood concentrated its force, it carved deep channels, but these were not the V-shaped valleys carved by rivers over millennia. These were steep-walled, flat-bottomed canyons cut directly into solid rock, as if a giant had taken a chisel to the earth. Geologists call them coulees, from the French word for flowing. Some of these coulees are staggering in their dimensions. Grand Coulee, the largest of them all, is over 50 miles long, 1.5 miles wide, and up to 900 feet deep, and it is dry, a canyon that vast, carved into solid basalt, and there is no river at the bottom of it. No stream fed by snowmelt or springs that could possibly account for its creation. It is a ghost canyon, a channel carved by a flood so enormous that once it passed, nothing was left behind to keep it company. Standing on the rim of a dry coulee, looking down at the sheer basalt cliffs and the flat, empty floor, you can feel the absence. It is a landscape defined by something that is no longer there. And then there are the potholes. When the floodwaters encountered irregularities in the terrain, perhaps a ridge of slightly harder rock or a constriction that forced the flow into a tight curve, they began to spin. Eddies formed massive whirlpools the size of stadiums, spinning with enough force to drill straight down into the basalt. These vortices rolled boulders and gravel around and around their basements, grinding the bedrock like a natural drill bit. The result is a landscape dotted with giant potholes, perfectly circular depressions carved into solid rock. Some are a few dozen feet across. Others are hundreds of feet wide and hundreds of feet deep. Today, many of them have filled with groundwater and become small, perfectly round lakes, known as the Channeled Scablands, pothole lakes. They are serene, beautiful even, tranquil cups of still water reflecting the sky. But their origin was pure chaos. The erosion patterns across the Scablands are like a fossilized current map. They reveal the flood's direction and its unimaginable force with unmistakable clarity. If you know how to read them, the rocks tell you exactly which way the water was moving. Long, streamlined ridges of basalt, called rock islands or streamlined hills, point southwest, aligned exactly with the flow direction. The floodwaters rushed over and around these remnants, shearing off the upstream ends and leaving long, tapering tails on the downstream side, like teardrops carved in stone. The deeper channels are gouged out on the downstream sides of ridges, where the water accelerated and its erosive power peaked. The rock is literally sculpted into flow forms. It looks like water frozen in an instant, because that is essentially what it is. The turbulence, the incredible pressure, the massive suspended load of rock and debris, all of it is recorded in the shapes of the stone. It is the hardest, most unyielding substance in the landscape, bent and shaped like clay by the sheer force of the current. What makes the Channeled Scablands so deeply unsettling and so fascinating is their otherworldly appearance. This is not a landscape shaped by the slow, patient forces we are accustomed to seeing. There are no meandering rivers, no gradual slopes, no gentle transitions from hill to valley. It is a landscape of abrupt edges, of deep shadows cast by vertical basalt cliffs, of vast flat expanses of bare rock, interspersed with chaotic channels and isolated buttes. Looking out across the Scablands from a high point, the terrain resembles a shattered plate, a vast dish of dark stone that has been smashed and then swept partially clean of the debris. Early geologists struggled to describe it, often resorting to comparisons with the moon or to battlefields. It looks like a place that has been bombed, excavated, and abandoned. It is desolate and dramatic in equal measure. But here is the crucial shift in perspective. This destruction was also creation. The same forces that stripped the earth bare and gouged the bedrock were also giving birth to entirely new landforms. The coulees, the dry cataracts, the giant potholes, the streamlined hills, none of these existed before the flood. They were carved in a geological instant, born from the destruction of the old landscape. The flood took a relatively uniform plain of soil and basalt, and sculpted it into one of the most distinctive, complex, and geologically informative terrains on Earth. It was not just erasing what was there, it was writing a new story into the stone. Every channel, every plunge pool, every stripped surface is a record of that terrible creative power. The Scablands are a wound, yes, but they are also a monument. A monument to the day the earth was unmade and remade by water. Among the countless scars the flood left across eastern Washington, there are certain places where the water's creative destruction reached its most spectacular heights. These are the landmarks that would become famous, visited by thousands of people every year, photographed and marvelled at, though most who stand before them have no idea they are looking at the aftermath of a catastrophe that defies comprehension. They see beauty, and they are right to see it, but it is a beauty born of raw, unfiltered destruction. Consider Dry Falls. If you visit it today, you will find a sweeping, majestic crescent of dark basalt cliffs, spanning 3.5 miles from end to end. At the base of these sheer cliffs, a series of calm, blue-green pools sit quietly, reflecting the sky and the rock above. It is peaceful. It is serene. But those cliffs are a waterfall. Or rather, they are the ghost of one. During the peak of the Missoula Floods, Dry Falls was not dry at all. It was the largest waterfall on the planet, and by a significant margin. Imagine Niagara Falls, that famous icon of natural power, and then stretch it out. Make it wider, far wider. Then multiply the volume of water pouring over its lip, not by 10, not by 100, but by an almost inconceivable factor. At its peak, the water pouring over Dry Falls was likely 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers on Earth today. 10 times every river, every stream, every trickle of water moving across the surface of the planet, multiplied tenfold and poured over a single cliff edge in eastern Washington. The water did not simply fall, it was launched. As it surged over the lip of the cataract, it dropped 400 feet, slamming into the plunge pool below with a force that generated continuous explosions of mist, debris, and shattered rock. The roar would have been felt in the chest as much as heard by the ears, a constant earthquake-like rumble that shook the ground for miles. The spray would have created its own localized weather system, a permanent shroud of mist and rain swirling in the air above the falls. And at the base of this towering cataract, the water was not content to simply pool and flow away. It gouged. It attacked the rock with such ferocity that it carved a plunge pool over a mile wide and hundreds of feet deep, a vast cauldron of churning, debris-laden water that hydraulic jacked the basalt apart and swallowed it whole. Today the falls are silent, the water is gone. What remains is the architecture of the waterfall, the immense stone frame that once contained the greatest cascade our planet has ever seen. Standing on the overlook, gazing across the 3.5 miles of empty cliff face, you can feel the absence like a weight. It is a theatre without a performance, a stage waiting for an actor who will never return. Not far from Dry Falls, the flood gave birth to another monument of a different kind, the Grand Coulee. We touched on its dimensions before, that staggering 50-mile length, the 1.5 mile width, the 900 feet of sheer depth. But consider what it actually represents. The Grand Coulee is not just a channel. It is an act of excavation so vast that it reconfigured the regional geography. Before the flood, this was a continuous plain of basalt and loess. There was no coulee here. There was no obvious path for water to follow. But when the ice dam broke and the Missoula waters poured across the landscape, they encountered a slight dip in the basalt surface, a subtle swale that funneled the initial flow. Once that flow concentrated, it began to carve, and as it carved it captured more water, and as it captured more water it carved deeper and faster in a devastating feedback loop. The flood essentially unzipped the earth along a 50-mile seam, tearing open a canyon that modern engineers would struggle to excavate with all the technology in the world. And it did it in a matter of days, maybe just a single terrible day of peak flow. The Grand Coulee is so immense that modern highway engineers simply built the road across the top of it, spanning the gap like a thread across a wound. The basalt walls drop away on either side, vertical and stark, exposing layers of ancient lava flows like the pages of a book, forced open and held apart by a power that has since vanished. Down at the bottom there is a thin ribbon of water today, a modest lake backed up behind a dam at the coulee's lower end. It looks almost like a joke, a tiny puddle sitting at the bottom of a vast, empty cathedral. The scale is all wrong for the water that is there now, but it is exactly right for the water that was there then. And then there is Palouse Falls, of all the landmarks born of the Missoula Floods. This may be the most visually striking. Here, a modest river drops nearly 200 feet into a bowl-shaped canyon surrounded by towering basalt amphitheatres. The water fans out as it falls, catching the light, creating a perpetual rainbow in the mist. It is gorgeous. It is also a mere trickle compared to what created it. Palouse Falls is a cataract that was carved when the floodwaters found a weakness in the basalt and exploited it ruthlessly, plunging over the edge and attacking the rock below until the cliff face retreated hundreds of yards upstream. The canyon that holds the falls is a plunge pool that was literally drilled out of the earth by the vortex of water and debris spinning at its base. Today, the Palouse River that feeds the falls is a quiet, gentle stream. It is completely incapable of having carved a basin it sits in. It is a guest in a house built by a giant, living quietly in the ruins of a catastrophe. This is the paradox of these landmarks. They are stunningly beautiful. Dry Falls, with its sweeping crescent of cliffs and tranquil pools, is a place of deep aesthetic power. The Grand Coulee is awe-inspiring in its sheer, brute scale. Palouse Falls is one of the most photographed natural features in Washington state. And yet, almost none of the people who visit these places, who stand at the railings and take their pictures, who marvel at the views, fully grasp what they are looking at. They see the result, but they do not see the process. They do not see the wall of water, the unimaginable force, the days of violence that sculpted these features out of solid rock. It is like looking at a crater left by a meteorite impact and admiring its shape without understanding that it was created by an explosion equivalent to a nuclear bomb. But the rock remembers. Every cliff face, every plunge pool, every streamlined ridge tells the story of that incredible power. These landmarks are not just scenery. They are evidence. They are the direct physical record of the day. The ice dams broke and half a continent drowned beneath a torrent that reshaped the very bones of the earth. They are monuments to a catastrophe so vast that it dwarfs anything in recorded human history. And they are there right now, waiting in the dry, sunny expanse of eastern Washington, for anyone who wants to see what happens when water is given enough time and enough force to become a force of creation itself. But here is where the story takes a turn that stretches the limits of comprehension. Because the Missoula flood was not a singular event. It was not one catastrophic day of water and destruction, after which the earth slowly healed and moved on. It was a cycle, a relentless, almost mechanical rhythm of creation and destruction that repeated itself again and again and again across thousands of years. To understand how this is possible, we have to return to the ice dam itself. When that towering wall of glacial ice finally gave way under the immense pressure of Lake Missoula, the water did not just leak out. It emptied. Hundreds of cubic miles of glacial meltwater drained from the lake in a matter of days, scouring eastern Washington, tearing through the Columbia River Gorge, and dumping its sediment-laden fury into the Pacific Ocean. The lake was gone. The dam was gone. The land behind where the dam had stood was suddenly exposed to the open air for the first time in who knows how long. But the glacier was still there, the massive ice sheet that had pushed its way down from the north. The frozen leviathan that had created the dam in the first place was still very much alive, and glaciers, as long as the climate remains cold enough, do not stop moving. They advance, they creep, they flow under their own immense weight, grinding forward inch by inch, day by day, relentlessly. So, after the flood, the glacier kept doing what glaciers do. It crept forward. Slowly, imperceptibly, the ice began to push its way back into the valley where the Clark Fork River ran. And over time, over decades, over centuries perhaps, that advancing ice once again reached the opposite valley wall. It blocked the river. It formed a new dam. And the Clark Fork, still flowing steadily from the mountains of western Montana, began to back up behind it. Lake Missoula began to refill. At first it would have been nothing more than a shallow pond, a quiet pool forming behind the new wall of ice. But the river never stopped flowing. Day after day, season after season, year after year, the water rose. The surface of the lake crept slowly up the sides of the surrounding mountains, drowning valleys that had only just begun to recover from the previous inundation. Forests that had taken root in the damp soil left behind by the last flood found their roots submerged again. The water climbed higher and higher and higher until it reached that critical point, the point where the pressure against the ice dam became too great, the point where the flotation force began to lift the glacier from its bed, the point where the dam broke, and then it happened all over again. The lake emptied, the flood roared across the landscape. The Scablands were scoured anew, the river gorges deepened, the valleys were inundated. And then the glacier advanced, the dam reformed, the lake refilled, and the dam broke once more. This is the repeating cycle, this is the almost unbelievable rhythm of the Missoula Floods. A rhythm of filling and failing, of patient accumulation, followed by catastrophic release, that played out over and over across millennia. Now, the obvious question is, how many times? How many separate flood events were there? And this is where the science gets complicated and where the uncertainty comes in, because geologists are still debating the answer. The evidence, however, points to a number that is staggering in its implications. The key to counting the floods lies in the layers. Each time Lake Missoula emptied, it left behind a record. As the floodwaters raced across eastern Washington and down the Columbia River Gorge, they carried immense loads of sediment, silt, clay, and debris. When the water finally slowed and began to recede, this material settled out, forming distinct layers of sediment in the quiet backwater areas and valleys along the flood's path. Then, after the flood was over and the land had dried out, a new layer of wind-blown silt, called lues, would settle on top of the flood deposits. Plants would take root, soil would begin to form, life would return, and then, years later, the next flood would hit, depositing another layer of sediment on top of everything that had come before. By examining these layers in road cuts, riverbanks, and specially excavated trenches, geologists have been able to count individual flood events. It is a bit like counting tree rings, except each ring represents a catastrophic flood, followed by a period of relative quiet. And the counts are remarkable. In some locations, researchers have identified dozens of distinct flood layers. The current consensus, based on the most thorough studies of these sediment sequences, suggests that there were at least 40 separate Missoula flood events. Some researchers argue the number could be as high as 80 or even 100. 40 to 100 separate floods, each one capable of reshaping the landscape of half a continent, each one involving the draining of a lake containing hundreds of cubic miles of water. But the uncertainty is real, and the debate is ongoing. Counting flood layers is not as straightforward as it might seem. Some floods were larger than others, and left more distinct deposits. Smaller floods might have left traces that were subsequently erased by larger ones. Some sediment layers might represent multiple flood pulses rather than a single event, and the dating of these layers, which relies on radiocarbon analysis of organic material found within the deposits and the identification of volcanic ash layers from known eruptions, is subject to margins of error that can span centuries. So while we can say with confidence that there were many floods, probably dozens, the exact number remains an open question. What is not in question is the sheer, staggering repetition of the cycle. Imagine it, a landscape caught in a rhythm of catastrophe that spans thousands of years. Each generation of plants and animals that colonizes the Scablands after a flood thinks this is the world. This is the permanent reality. The dry channels, the barren rock, the thin soils slowly beginning to rebuild. They have no memory of the flood that created these features. They do not know that the glacier to the north is slowly advancing, that the river is slowly backing up, that the lake is slowly rising. They do not know that they are living on borrowed time. And then, without warning, the dam breaks again. The water returns. The world drowns. This cycle repeated itself over a span of roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years during the peak of the last ice age, between about 18,000 and 15,000 years ago. Some researchers think the cycle may have extended even further back in time, 2,000 to 3,000 years of repeated catastrophe. An almost inconceivable duration of geological violence. It is worth pausing for a moment to really let that sink in. We are not talking about a single disaster, however vast. We are talking about a catastrophe machine, a process that turned the Pacific Northwest into a landscape of perpetual destruction and renewal, where the very bones of the earth were subjected to a rhythmic assault that carved canyons, moved mountains of soil, and left scars that are still visible from space today. The repeating cycle of the Missoula Floods is one of the most extraordinary geological processes ever discovered on our planet, and its consequences did not end with the Scablands of eastern Washington. As the floodwaters poured out of the Channeled Scablands, they converged and funneled into a narrow corridor that would concentrate their power even further. A deep, dramatic gorge that the flood would transform into a highway of destruction on its way to the sea. Imagine standing in a shallow stream, looking down at the sandy bottom beneath your feet. You would see them everywhere. Small, rhythmic ridges in the sediment, alternating peaks and valleys, carved by the steady flow of water over loose material. They are so common, so ordinary, that most of us barely notice them. Ripple marks, the signature of moving water written in sand and silt. Now imagine those same ripple marks, the exact same shape, the same mathematical pattern of crests and troughs, but scaled up. Scaled up until each ridge stands 30 feet high, until the distance from one crest to the next stretches longer than a football field, until the troughs between them are broad enough to swallow houses, to hide entire neighbourhoods in their shadows. This is not imagination. This is real. These are the giant current ripples of the Missoula flood, and they are scattered across the scablands of eastern Washington like fingerprints at a crime scene. They were not always recognized for what they are. In fact, for decades, nobody saw them at all. Not really. People drove past them, walked over them, built farms on them. They were just rolling hills, gentle undulations in the landscape that seemed to have no particular story to tell. The locals in the Scablands region had a name for this terrain. They called it the Ripple Land. It was a descriptive label, accurate enough in its way, but nobody understood the profound significance hidden in those gentle swells. To appreciate why these features were so easily overlooked, you have to understand the scale. When you are standing on the ground, your perspective is limited. You can see the hill in front of you, the valley behind it, maybe the next rise beyond that. But you cannot see the pattern. It is like standing inside a single letter on a page and trying to read the sentence. You are too close. The rhythm of the ripples, the regularity of their spacing, the unmistakable signature of flowing water, all of that is invisible from the surface. It was not until researchers began looking at the Scablands from above that the truth became undeniable. Aerial photography and later satellite imagery revealed what ground-level observation had missed entirely. From 1,000 feet up, or from orbit, the landscape of the Scablands suddenly displayed a pattern so clear, so unmistakable, that it could only mean one thing. Water, massive, powerful, fast-moving water, flowing across the land with enough force to sculpt ridges the size of hills. The ripples appear in several locations across the Scablands, but some of the most dramatic examples are found in the vicinity of Spirit Lake, near the Idaho-Washington border, and in the Camas Prairie Basin in Montana, which had served as a temporary holding pond during the floods. In these areas the floodwaters slowed briefly, dropping their heaviest sediment loads before accelerating once again through narrow outlets. The result is a field of giant current ripples that stretches for miles, each one a perfect enlarged replica of the tiny marks you might find in a creek bed. The shape is identical, steep on the downstream side where the water flow eroded material, and gentle on the upstream side where sediment was deposited. This asymmetry is the hallmark of ripples formed by moving water, as opposed to the symmetrical ripples created by wave action in standing water. These are current ripples formed by unidirectional flow, and the direction of that flow is still readable today, etched into the land, pointing the way the water went, pointing southwest toward the Columbia River and the sea beyond. But what do these enormous ripples tell us about the flood itself? This is where the science gets truly remarkable, because the size of current ripples is directly related to the depth and velocity of the water that created them. Bigger ripples mean deeper, faster water. The relationship is not linear. It is exponential to form ripples with crests spaced 100 meters apart, and standing 10 meters high, you need water that is not just deep, but astoundingly deep. Calculations based on the dimensions of the giant current ripples suggest flood depths of hundreds of feet in some locations. Flow velocities estimated from ripple geometry reach truly terrifying numbers. We are talking about water moving at speeds that would rival or exceed the fastest river rapids on Earth today, except this water was not confined to a narrow channel. It was spread across miles of open landscape, a sheet of liquid fury sweeping everything before it. The ripples also tell us about the nature of the sediment. The water was moving. These are not ripples carved in fine sand or silt. They are ripples carved in gravel. Cobbles, stones, boulders the size of cars, all of it mobilized, rolled, and sorted by the immense hydraulic forces of the flood. Each ripple represents a complete reshuffling of the surface geology, an act of destruction and reorganization so thorough that nothing of the pre-flood landscape survived in its path. When early geologists first encountered claims about these giant ripples, the reaction was, predictably, skepticism. The same skepticism that greeted J Harlen Bretz's entire flood hypothesis. Ripples the size of houses, formed in a single flood event. It seemed absurd. It seemed like the kind of exaggeration that gave catastrophic geology a bad name. The prevailing uniformitarian view, the idea that geological change is slow, gradual, and governed by processes we can observe today, had no room for ripples that large. But the evidence was there. You could walk the ripples. You could measure them, you could photograph them from above, and see the unmistakable pattern. And most importantly, you could compare them to laboratory experiments and mathematical models that predicted exactly this kind of feature from exactly this kind of flow. The giant current ripples were not a geological anomaly. They were a geological prediction confirmed by the land itself. Today, these immense ripple marks stand as some of the most compelling physical evidence for the Missoula Floods. They are the flood's signature, repeated across the landscape in a script so large it could only be read from the sky. They tell us that the water came, that it was deep, that it was fast, and that it carried enough force to reshape the very bones of the earth. They are proof that sometimes the quiet ridges beneath our feet hold memories of catastrophes almost beyond imagining. And they are not the only stones that remember. They are not the only stones that remember. Scattered across the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, far from the mountains where they were born, sit rocks that do not belong. They rest in fields of golden wheat. They loom at the edges of quiet country roads. They sit in the middle of suburban neighborhoods shaded by oak trees, surrounded by picnickers who may not realize they are touching a relic of the apocalypse. These are glacial erratics, and their story is one of the most astonishing chapters in the entire Missoula Flood saga. To understand what makes a rock erratic, you have to look at where it came from. The word itself gives a clue: erratic, wanderer, deviating from the normal course. In geology, an erratic is a rock that differs entirely from the bedrock beneath it. It is a stranger in a strange land, transported from its point of origin by forces far beyond what we typically witness in the natural world. Imagine walking through a forest of tall pines and suddenly encountering a massive boulder of pink granite sitting on a foundation of dark basalt. The granite did not form there. It has no business being there. It was moved, but how? A boulder weighing hundreds of tons cannot simply roll across the countryside. Gravity alone cannot explain its presence. The answer, in the context of the Missoula Floods, involves one of the most surreal and powerful mechanisms in all of geology: rafted ice. When Glacial Lake Missoula broke through its ice dam and surged across the landscape, it did not travel as pure water. It carried with it an enormous load of solid debris. Chunks of the retreating glacier, some the size of small islands, were ripped from the ice sheet and swept into the torrent. These were not mere ice cubes floating in a stream. They were miniature glaciers themselves, massive slabs of frozen water embedded with the detritus of the mountains they had scraped and ground over for millennia. Rocks, boulders, gravel, sand, and fine silt were locked inside them, like fossils in amber. As the floodwaters raced across the Channeled Scablands, these icebergs were carried along at terrifying speeds. Some grounded on ridgetops. Some were trapped in eddies and swirled in massive circles, scouring the bedrock below. And some eventually melted, dropping their rocky cargo in places no rock of that type had ever existed before. It was a delivery system of unimaginable scale, a natural freight network powered by the greatest floods the continent has ever seen. The distribution of these erratics provides a map of the flood's reach, a trail of breadcrumbs leading from the ice fields of northern Idaho and Montana all the way to the Willamette Valley in Oregon and beyond. Some of the most famous erratics in the region are made of argillite, a hard, fine-grained metamorphic rock that originated in the belt supergroup formations of western Montana. These rocks have been found hundreds of miles from their source, resting in the soft soils of eastern Washington as if placed there by some cosmic landscaping crew. Their presence is a smoking gun, irrefutable evidence that water, ice, and immense power connected these distant landscapes in a single catastrophic event. Other erratics are composed of granite, quartzite, and gneiss, rock types common in the Rocky Mountains, but entirely absent from the basalt plains of the Columbia Basin. Some of these stones are enormous, the size of houses. Others are smaller, cobble-sized, and scattered like marbles across the surface. But size is not what makes them significant. Their composition is. Every erratic is a geological fingerprint, a piece of a distant mountain range that was picked up, transported, and deposited by forces that defy our everyday experience of the natural world. Before we continue tracing the path of these wandering stones, I want to share something with you. If you find yourself captivated by these deep prehistoric mysteries, the ancient events that shaped our world in ways we are only now beginning to understand, you might enjoy our book about prehistoric secrets. It is available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there is a discount this week if you're interested. Now, back to the rocks. The erratics were crucial in confirming the true scale and reach of the Missoula Floods. When J Harlen Bretz first proposed his catastrophic flood theory, many of his colleagues struggled to accept it. The idea that water could traverse such vast distances with such destructive force seemed almost mythical, but the erratics told a story that could not be dismissed. They were tangible, physical proof that material had been transported across hundreds of miles in a very short time. There was no gradual process, No slow erosion over millennia that could explain a granite boulder from Montana sitting in an Oregon valley. Only a massive, high-energy flood could accomplish such a thing. And the Erratics did more than confirm the flood's existence. They helped map its pathways. By cataloguing the types of erratics and their distribution, geologists could trace the routes the floodwaters took, identify where the current was fastest, and determine where it slowed enough to drop its heaviest loads. Erratics found at high elevations along the flood path demonstrated the depth of the water, proving that the flood had submerged entire ridge systems. Those found in clusters suggested areas where the current had eddied, swirling in giant vortices that trapped ice flows and eventually deposited their rocky passengers as the ice melted and the waters receded. Piece by piece, the Erratics helped solve the broader puzzle of reconstructing this ancient event. They were not just isolated curiosities or geological oddities to be marvelled at. They were data points, each one a small but vital clue in a detective story spanning millennia. Combined with the giant current ripples, the stripped bedrock of the Scablands, and the sediment deposits in the Willamette Valley, the Erratics painted a picture of a catastrophe so immense that it redraw the map of an entire region. A picture of ice dams breaking, of lakes emptying in days, of a wall of water carrying mountains on its back. Each erratic resting quietly in its unexpected home is a monument to that incredible journey and a silent witness to the day the world changed. From those scattered erratics resting quietly in their unexpected homes, we can trace the floodwaters as they continued their relentless journey westward. The wandering stones mark the path, but to truly understand what happened next, we have to follow the water itself as it left the Scablands behind and funneled into one of the most spectacular natural features on the continent, the Columbia River Gorge. Imagine the scene. The flood has already ripped across eastern Washington, carving the Channeled Scablands, carrying boulders and ice rafts for hundreds of miles. But the Scablands are relatively open. The water could spread out, sometimes covering hundreds of square miles at once. As the flood surged westward, it began to collect, to consolidate, drawn by gravity and topography, toward the only outlet available. The narrow, steep-walled canyon carved through the Cascade Mountains by the ancient Columbia River. What had been a vast, shallow inland sea of turbulent, debris-laden water was now being forced into a bottleneck, and the results were staggering. Think of it like putting your thumb over the end of a garden hose. The same volume of water forced through a smaller opening accelerates dramatically. But this wasn't a garden hose. This was a flood containing roughly 500 cubic miles of water, maybe more, all trying to squeeze through a canyon that in some places is less than 2 miles wide. The water had nowhere to go but up, and it had nowhere to flow but forward at terrifying speed. As the flood entered the gorge, its character changed. In the open country of the Scablands, the water had moved fast, but it had room to breathe. In the gorge, it became a concentrated torrent of almost unimaginable power. The canyon walls, primarily composed of dense basalt, flows layered like a colossal stack of pancakes, constrained the flood on both sides. The water depth increased dramatically. Current speeds may have exceeded 70 or 80 miles per hour in the narrowest sections. The sound must have been beyond comprehension, a continuous roar that shook the ground for miles around, echoing off the vertical cliff faces until the air itself seemed to vibrate with the violence of the event. And the evidence of this immense depth is still visible today, written on the canyon walls like a bathtub ring from a nightmare. High above the modern river, in places where the gorge narrows significantly, geologists have found markings that indicate flood levels reaching 700 feet above the current river surface. Let that number settle for a moment. 700 feet. That is taller than a 60-story building. The floodwaters filled the Columbia River Gorge to a depth that would completely submerge modern skyscrapers. If you stand at certain viewpoints along the gorge today and look up at the sheer basalt cliffs, you can trace the lines where the water reached its peak. There are scour marks, places where the torrent stripped away loose rock and soil from the canyon walls. There are deposits of gravel and sand perched impossibly high on ledges and slopes where no normal river could ever place them. There are giant current ripples etched into the canyon floor, similar to those found in the Scablands, but formed underwater in the confined channel of the gorge. The flood's interaction with the existing Columbia River system is particularly fascinating. Before the ice dam broke, the Columbia was already a major river, draining a huge portion of the Pacific Northwest. It had carved its gorge over millions of years, a slow, steady process of erosion through the Cascade Mountains. When the Missoula flood hit, it didn't just add water to the existing river. It overwhelmed it entirely. The Columbia became a minor player in its own channel, its flow completely reversed and subsumed by the catastrophic influx from the east. The force of the flood scoured the riverbed, deepening and widening the gorge in places, ripping away centuries of sediment and loose rock, exposing the clean basalt underneath. Tributary streams flowing into the Columbia from the north and south were also affected. As the main flood surged through the gorge, it backed up water into these side valleys, creating temporary lakes that rose hundreds of feet before draining back out as the flood receded. Some of these tributary valleys show evidence of their own mini-floods, triggered when the backed-up water finally released. It is a cascade of destruction within a cascade, a hierarchy of catastrophe that boggles the mind. There is a strange poetry in what this violence created. The Columbia River Gorge is today renowned as one of the most beautiful places in North America. Its towering cliffs, its countless waterfalls, its lush forests of fir and cedar, its dramatic views of snow-capped volcanic peaks, all of these draw millions of visitors every year. But that beauty was born from catastrophe. The sheer vertical walls that make the gorge so spectacular were shaped and deepened by floodwaters that tore through the canyon with enough force to reshape solid rock. The waterfalls that cascade over the basalt cliffs, iconic destinations like Multnomah Falls and Bridal Veil Falls, exist in their current form because the floods stripped away the softer rock and soil that might otherwise have concealed or redirected the streams. The flat benches and terraces along the gorge, now covered in rich vegetation, were carved by the floodwaters at different stages of the inundation. Even the shape of the riverbed itself, with its deep pools and dramatic rapids, bears the fingerprint of the great floods. It is a paradox that is common in geology. The most destructive forces often create the most beautiful landscapes. Slow, gentle erosion produces rolling hills and gentle valleys. Catastrophic violence produces the dramatic, the spectacular, the awe-inspiring. The Columbia River Gorge is a monument to this principle, a place where beauty and terror are eternally intertwined. As the flood emerged from the western end of the gorge near the present site of Portland, it began to spread out again, but its energy was still enormous. The water had been compressed and accelerated through the canyon, and now it was released into a broader landscape, but it was not done reshaping the world. To the south lay the Willamette Valley, a wide, flat basin that would become the next victim of the flood's relentless passage. To the west lay the Columbia's final stretch to the Pacific Ocean, a journey that would carry the flood's influence far out to sea. But first, the waters turned south, pouring into the Willamette Valley with a force that would transform that landscape forever. The erratics we discussed earlier, those wandering stones from the mountains of Montana, many of them were carried through the gorge on ice rafts before being deposited in the quiet fields of Oregon. The flood's journey through the gorge was the critical link between the Scablands of Washington and the transformed valleys of Oregon, a narrow corridor of unimaginable power connecting two landscapes shaped by the same impossible event. As the floodwaters exploded out of the western end of the Columbia River Gorge, near where the city of Portland sits today, they encountered a landscape that offered a very different kind of resistance. Or rather, no resistance at all. After being compressed and accelerated through the narrow basalt-walled bottleneck of the gorge, the water was finally free to spread out. But it didn't just flow west toward the Pacific. A massive portion of the torrent turned south, pouring into a wide, flat, low-lying basin that geologists now call the Willamette Valley, and in doing so it transformed this quiet corner of Oregon in ways that are still visible and still incredibly useful today. Imagine the mechanics of this. You have a wall of water, mud, ice and rock moving with the force of a dozen rivers combined. It hits the broader plains and immediately begins to seek the lowest ground. The Willamette Valley, shielded from the direct western flow by the Coast Range, acted like a massive catchment basin. The floodwaters surged into the valley through its narrow northern opening, and because the outlet at the southern end was restricted, the water had nowhere to go but up. It began to back up, rising steadily, filling the valley floor like a gigantic bathtub. Temporary lakes formed vast and turbulent, covering the entire valley floor. We are not talking about a shallow puddle here. At its peak, the water in the Willamette Valley may have reached depths of 300 feet or more, submerging the modern sites of cities like Portland, Salem and Eugene under a frigid, debris-laden inland sea. These lakes would have existed for days, maybe weeks, after each flood event, slowly draining back north into the Columbia as the main flood subsided, leaving behind a stagnant, muddy wasteland that would take years to fully recover. But the flood didn't just bring water, it brought dirt. Incredible amounts of it, as the torrent ripped across eastern Washington and scoured the Columbia River Gorge. It picked up immense quantities of sediment, silt, clay, and rock flour, the finely ground powder created when glaciers scrape against bedrock. This sediment was suspended in the turbulent water, turning it into a thick, muddy slurry. When that water slowed down and backed up into the Willamette Valley, it lost the energy needed to carry its load. And so the sediment fell out of suspension, settling to the bottom of the temporary lakes in layers that would eventually become some of the most fertile agricultural land in North America. Those sediment deposits are still there today, lying beneath the fields and orchards of modern Oregon. The Willamette Valley is famous for its agriculture. It produces everything from hazelnuts and berries to wine grapes and Christmas trees, and it does so because of a catastrophic flood that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. The soil in the valley is deep, rich, and well drained, a direct result of the fine glacial silt deposited by the Missoula Floods. Farmers in the Willamette Valley are quite literally reaping the harvest of the Ice Age. Every time a tractor turns the soil, it is churning up the legacy of the greatest flood in North American history. The very shape of the farmland, the flat, even valley floor, the gentle terraces carved by receding floodwaters, is a gift from Catastrophe. It is a strange and beautiful irony that an event of such immense destruction created the foundation for such abundance. But it was not just mud and silt that the flood left behind. Remember those ice rafts we talked about earlier? The frozen chunks of the ice dam that floated across the Scablands carrying boulders? Many of them continued their journey through the Columbia River Gorge and into the Willamette Valley. As the flood waters backed up and slowed, these icebergs drifted across the temporary lakes, melting slowly in the frigid water. And when they melted, the rocks they were carrying dropped straight to the bottom. Today, scattered across the Willamette Valley, far from any mountain or rock formation that could have produced them, are erratic boulders. Some are the size of cars, others the size of houses. They sit in fields, in forests, in parks, and even in people's backyards. They are made of rock types that are completely foreign to the valley, granites and gneisses and other metamorphic rocks that originated hundreds of miles away in the mountains of Montana, British Columbia, or the Cascade Range. These boulders are silent witnesses to the flood, physical proof that the waters reached this far south and carried with them the wreckage of a continent. There is something deeply haunting about these erratics. They rest in the green fields of Oregon like sleeping visitors from another world. You can walk up to one of these boulders, place your hand on its cold surface, and know that it was transported here by a wall of water that would have erased you from existence in a heartbeat. It travelled on an iceberg, floating across a temporary lake that covered the valley where millions of people now live, and it came to rest in the mud when the ice melted and the waters receded. Each erratic is a small monument to the power of the flood, a reminder that the ground we stand on is not always as stable or as permanent as it seems. And this is where the true scale of the Missoula floods really starts to sink in. It is one thing to talk about the Scablands, a dramatic but relatively confined area in eastern Washington. It is another to realize that the same flood, the same event, also shaped a valley 100 miles to the south, depositing soil that would feed generations, leaving boulders that would puzzle settlers for centuries, and creating a landscape that bears almost no visible resemblance to the violent process that created it. The Willamette Valley is the quiet aftermath of catastrophe, the gentle, productive landscape that emerged from the chaos. It is evidence that destruction and creation are often two sides of the same coin, that the same force that can tear a continent apart can also lay the foundation for new growth. The flooding of the Willamette Valley also helps us understand the broader continental scale of the event. This was not a local flood. This was not a regional disaster. This was a hydrological event that spanned thousands of miles, from the ice dams of Montana to the valleys of Oregon and beyond. The floodwaters that shaped the Willamette Valley were the same waters that carved the Channeled Scablands, the same waters that ripped through the Columbia River Gorge, the same waters that would eventually reach the Pacific Ocean and carry their sediment out into the deep sea. The Missoula Floods were a single, interconnected event, a cascade of water and debris that reshaped half a continent. And the Willamette Valley, with its rich soil and its wandering boulders, is just one chapter in that much larger story. And so the water kept moving. After backing up into the Willamette Valley, after dropping its load of silt and boulders across the plains of Oregon, the remainder of the flood's immense volume continued its relentless push westward. The water that had carved the Scablands, that had ripped through the Columbia River Gorge, that had inundated valleys and carried icebergs across temporary inland seas, was finally approaching the end of its overland journey. It was reaching the Pacific Ocean. But imagine what this meeting must have looked like. We are not talking about a river calmly emptying into the sea. The flood waters pouring out of the Columbia River's mouth were still carrying an almost incomprehensible volume of water, mud, rock, flour, and debris. This was a torrent pushing with the force of 1,000 rivers, a churning, muddy plume, exploding into the coastal waters of the Pacific. The ocean here would have turned brown for miles, its salt water overwhelmed by the sheer mass of fresh water and sediment crashing into it. It was a collision of elements on a scale that is difficult to truly grasp, a continental-scale plumbing system violently discharging into the world's largest body of water. And here is where the story takes a fascinating turn, moving from the visible landscapes of Washington and Oregon into the hidden depths of the ocean floor. For decades, geologists studied the Scablands, the Gorge, and the Willamette Valley, piecing together the evidence of the floods from what they could see on land. But the flood had left a record in another place entirely, a record that would not be discovered until scientists began pulling long tubes of mud from the bottom of the sea, off the coast of Oregon and Washington, and stretching far out into the deep Pacific. The ocean floor is covered in layers of sediment, that have accumulated over millions of years. Most of this sediment arrives slowly, a steady rain of tiny marine organisms, dust blown from the land, and the normal runoff from rivers. It builds up gradually, layer upon layer, creating a chronological record of environmental conditions, a deep-sea diary of the Earth's history. And buried within that diary are unmistakable signatures of the Missoula Floods. When scientists began analyzing deep-sea sediment cores taken from the Pacific floor, they noticed something strange. Interspersed within the regular, slow-accumulating marine sediments were distinct layers of terrestrial material. Thick bands of silt, clay, and fine sand that looked nothing like the steady rain of deep-sea mud. These layers were rich in freshwater diatoms, the microscopic algae that had lived in Glacial Lake Missoula, and in rock flour, the signature powder created by glaciers grinding against bedrock. It was the fingerprint of the floods, preserved thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean. Think about what this means. The floodwaters had enough energy and volume to carry sediment, not just to the coast, but far out to sea. These deposits have been traced over 100 miles from the shoreline, lying in water depths of thousands of feet. The flood was pushing its load across the continental shelf, over the edge, and down into the abyssal depths. This is not how normal rivers behave. Even the mightiest rivers in the world, the Amazon, the Congo, the Mississippi, drop most of their sediment relatively close to shore. But the Missoula floods were something else entirely, a force so powerful that it injected continental debris deep into the ocean's most remote regions. Each flood event left its own layer in the sediment record, a thin band of light-coloured silt sandwiched between the darker marine mud. By counting these bands and measuring their thickness, scientists have been able to independently confirm what land-based geologists had long suspected. The floods happened not just once, but many times, over a period of thousands of years. The ocean floor was catching the overflow each time an ice dam broke, quietly recording the pulses of catastrophe in a way that the chaotic, eroded landscapes on land could not always clearly preserve. But the deep-sea evidence does more than just confirm the number of floods. It also reveals the truly staggering volume of fresh water that was released. To push a layer of silt over 100 miles out to sea, you need an almost unimaginable amount of water moving at tremendous speed. The ocean is not passive in this scenario. Coastal currents, tides, and the sheer density difference between fresh and salt water all work against the seaward transport of sediment. For the flood plume to overcome these forces and carry its load so far, the volume of water must have been virtually apocalyptic. Some estimates suggest that the freshwater discharge from a single flood event could have been equivalent to the total outflow of all the world's rivers combined, concentrated into a matter of days or weeks. And that freshwater didn't just vanish, it sat on top of the ocean, a vast, thin lens of fresh and brackish water spreading out across the surface of the Pacific, slowly mixing with the salt water over months or even years. This massive injection of fresh water into the Pacific would have had profound, if temporary, impacts on the marine environment. The surface waters off the coast would have experienced a dramatic drop in salinity, potentially disrupting the delicate balance of marine ecosystems. Phytoplankton and zooplankton, the tiny organisms that form the base of the ocean food web, are highly sensitive to changes in salt concentration. A sudden, massive influx of fresh water could have caused widespread die-offs, rippling up the food chain to affect fish, marine mammals, and seabirds. The flood was not just reshaping the land, it was stressing the ocean itself. There may also have been longer-term effects on ocean circulation. The North Pacific is a critical region for global ocean currents, and these currents are driven in part by differences in water density, which are determined by temperature and salinity. A sudden influx of massive volumes of cold fresh water could have temporarily disrupted local circulation patterns, altering the way heat and nutrients were distributed throughout the Pacific. While the evidence for this is still being studied and debated, the possibility highlights just how powerful the floods were. They were not just a regional geological event, they were a global hydrological phenomenon, capable of leaving a mark on the world's oceans. The deep-sea sediment cores serve as a final, definitive confirmation of the Missoula Floods' massive scale. You can look at the Scablands and appreciate the erosive power of the water. You can examine the Willamette Valley and understand how the flood deposited its sediment load. But when you find the same flood signature on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, over 100 miles from shore in water thousands of feet deep, you realize that this was an event of planetary significance. The ice dams of Montana did not just reshape a corner of North America. They sent their message across the continent and into the deep sea, where it remains to this day a quiet testament to the raw, unbridled power of water unleashed. And yet, for all the evidence the floods left behind, from the Scablands to the ocean floor, for decades the scientific establishment refused to believe they had happened. The idea that a single flood could carve a landscape was considered impossible, a throwback to outdated ways of thinking. It would take one stubborn geologist, a man with an eye for the impossible, to challenge the consensus and force the world to see what the water had done. His name was J Harlen Bretz, and his story is as remarkable as the floods themselves. J Harlen Bretz was not the kind of man who easily let things go. Born in 1882 on a farm in Michigan, he had spent his early career as a high school biology teacher before finding his way into geology somewhat later in life. He was in his 40s when he finally took a teaching position at the University of Chicago, which meant he came to the discipline as an outsider, not as a prodigy groomed from adolescence in the hallowed halls of Eastern academia. He was stubborn, meticulous, and possessed of a restless, questioning mind that was never quite satisfied with the explanations he found in textbooks. He looked at the earth not through the lens of established theory, but through his own two eyes. In the summer of 1922, Bretz organized the first of what would become many field trips into the Columbia Plateau region of eastern Washington. He was drawn there by peculiar reports of a landscape that defied conventional understanding. What he found when he arrived would consume the rest of his professional life. The Scablands were unlike anything he had ever encountered. This was not a terrain shaped by the slow, patient work of rivers over millions of years. It looked, for all the world, like the land had been attacked. Massive dry waterfalls, known as cataracts, stood in the middle of nowhere, amphitheatres of basalt that had no living rivers to feed them. Deep, braided channels carved into solid rock snaked across the plateau, plunging into potholes that could swallow entire buildings. Giant boulders sat stranded in fields, perched on the landscape like marbles dropped by a careless giant. Everything about the Scablands spoke of violence, of a sudden, overwhelming force that had been unleashed and then vanished. Bretz walked those channels for weeks, mapping the terrain with painstaking care. He measured the dimensions of the cataracts, noting how the basalt had been plucked away in massive blocks. He traced the paths of the current, reading the signs etched into the bedrock like a detective reading a crime scene. And slowly, a conviction began to form in his mind, a conviction that would put him on a collision course with the entire geological establishment. The only explanation that made sense, the only mechanism capable of producing what he saw, was a flood of almost unimaginable proportions. A single catastrophic deluge that had swept across the plateau with the force of 1,000 rivers, carving the Scablands in a matter of days. To understand why this idea was so explosive, you have to understand the intellectual world of early 20th century geology. For over a century, the discipline had been dominated by a principle called uniformitarianism, first articulated by James Hutton in the late 1700s and popularized by Charles Lyell in the 1830s. Uniformitarianism held that the Earth's geological features were shaped by the slow, gradual operation of the same processes we see today. Rivers erode their banks grain by grain. Mountains rise by imperceptible increments over millions of years. Canyons are carved by the patient, relentless flow of water over eons. The present, uniformitarianism declared, is the key to the past. Small causes operating over vast stretches of time produce great effects. This was not just a working hypothesis, it was dogma, and it had served geology well, helping to liberate the discipline from earlier notions of biblical catastrophism. The idea that the earth had been shaped by a series of divine floods and cataclysms. By Bretz's time, uniformitarianism had become the unquestioned foundation of geological thinking. To suggest that a landscape might have been formed by a sudden, violent catastrophe was to risk being labelled a heretic, a throwback to the pre-scientific days of flood theology. It was to challenge the very framework upon which modern geology had been built. But Bretz was not suggesting catastrophe out of ignorance or religious fervour. He was suggesting it because the evidence demanded it. The Scablands simply did not fit the gradualist model. No river, no matter how much time you gave it, could carve the Grand Coulee or dry up Palouse Falls cataract. The channels were too deep, the erosion too sudden, the features too colossal. The basalt had not been worn away grain by grain. It had been ripped apart in massive chunks, plucked from the bedrock by water moving with terrifying velocity. The gravel bars were not the slow accretions of lazy streams. They were giant ridges of sediment, dumped in place by currents that could carry boulders like pebbles. Everywhere Bretz looked, the evidence told the same story. A story of sudden, catastrophic flooding on a scale that defied comprehension. Bretz knew what he was up against. He knew that publishing a paper claiming a catastrophic flood had carved the Scablands would provoke a storm of opposition. But he also knew what he had seen in the field. He had walked the channels, measured the cataracts, traced the current lines. He had spent years accumulating data, and the data pointed in one direction only. He was not a man given to wild speculation. He was a careful, methodical scientist who believed in letting the rocks speak for themselves. And the rocks were shouting about a flood. There was something in Bretz's character that made him uniquely suited for the battle ahead. He was not just stubborn, though he was certainly that. He was also deeply confident in his own observations. He trusted what he had seen with his own eyes more than he trusted the theoretical models developed by men who had never set foot in the Scablands. He had a certain puckish humour, a delight in being contrarian that made the prospect of taking on the establishment more appealing than frightening. He was not interested in playing the academic game, in smoothing his rough edges to fit into the polished corridors of university politics. He was interested in the truth as he saw it, and he was willing to fight for it. In 1923, Bretz published his first paper on the Scablands, titled The Channeled Scabland of the Columbia Plateau. In it, he laid out his evidence and his conclusions with characteristic directness. The Scablands, he argued, had been formed by a massive, sudden flood of glacial meltwater, a flood so enormous that it had overwhelmed the existing drainage system and carved an entirely new landscape in a matter of days. He did not mince words. He did not hedge his bets or offer his theory as one possible interpretation among many. He presented it as the only explanation that fit the facts. The reaction was swift and severe. Bretz's paper was met with near universal condemnation from the geological establishment. Prominent geologists, including some of the most respected names in the field, lined up to denounce his flood theory as absurd, unscientific, and dangerously close to catastrophism. They accused him of ignoring the principles of uniformitarianism, of invoking a deus ex machina to explain features that could surely be accounted for by gradual processes given enough time. They suggested he had misread the evidence, that he lacked the theoretical sophistication to understand what he was seeing. Some of the criticism was harsh, even personal. Bretz was made to feel like a heretic in his own church. But he refused to back down. Over the next several years, Bretz continued his fieldwork, returning to the Scablands season after season, gathering more data, documenting more features that defied gradual explanation. Each new observation strengthened his case. Each new measurement made the flood hypothesis more compelling and the conventional explanations more inadequate. He published paper after paper, each one a careful, detailed rebuttal of his critics' arguments. He answered their objections with evidence, not rhetoric. He showed them the potholes, the current markings, the giant ripple marks. He walked them through the logic of his interpretation, step by step, and dared them to find a flaw. The establishment remained unmoved. Year after year, Bretz stood alone against the weight of geological opinion, a single voice insisting on a truth that no one else was willing to hear. It was a position that would have broken a lesser person, but Bretz was not a lesser person. He was a man who had seen something in the landscape that no one else had seen, and he was determined to make them see it too. The opposition Bretz faced was not merely academic disagreement. It was something deeper, almost visceral, a rejection that went to the very heart of what it meant to practice science in the early 20th century. When Bretz stood before his colleagues and argued for a catastrophic flood, he was not just proposing a new interpretation of some obscure landforms. He was challenging the foundational myth of an entire discipline, and the discipline fought back with everything it had. To understand the ferocity of the response, you have to understand the ghost that haunted geology. For centuries, the study of the earth had been entangled with religion. The dominant framework for understanding geological features in the Western world was catastrophism, the idea that the earth had been shaped by a series of sudden divine cataclysms, most notably the biblical flood of Noah. This was not a scientific theory in the modern sense. It was an article of faith, an attempt to reconcile the observable features of the earth with the narrative of Scripture. When early geologists looked at massive boulder deposits or deeply carved valleys, they saw the hand of God acting in sudden miraculous judgment. The rise of uniformitarianism in the 19th century was not just a scientific revolution. It was a liberation, by showing that the same slow, gradual processes observable today could, given enough time, produce all the geological features of the earth. Hutton and Lyell freed geology from theology. They made it possible to study the earth on its own terms, without recourse to miracles or divine interventions. Uniformitarianism became the defining principle of the discipline, the line that separated legitimate science from religious speculation. And for over a century it had worked. It had provided a framework for understanding the earth that was rational, consistent, and profoundly successful. But principles can become dogmas, and dogmas can become blinders. By Bretz's time, uniformitarianism had hardened into something rigid and unquestioned. The idea that geological features could be produced by sudden, violent events was not just considered unlikely. It was considered unscientific, a betrayal of the very principles that made geology a legitimate field of study. To suggest a catastrophic flood was to invoke the ghost of Noah, to threaten the hard-won secular credentials of the discipline. It was to open a door that geologists had spent a century trying to close. This is why the reaction to Bretz was so fierce. His colleagues did not simply think he was wrong. They thought he was dangerous. He was suggesting that the boundary between science and religion was not as firm as they believed, that there might be room in geology for catastrophes after all. If a single massive flood could carve the Scablands, what other catastrophic events might be lurking in the Earth's history? The entire edifice of gradualism seemed to tremble. The key battleground was a series of meetings and publications where Bretz defended his theory against a barrage of criticism. In 1927, the Geological Society of Washington, D.C. organized a special session devoted to Bretz's flood hypothesis. It was, in effect, a trial. Bretz was not present that evening, which was perhaps just as well. He was in Chicago teaching his classes, while in Washington, some of the most prominent geologists in the country lined up to dismantle his life's work. One by one, they rose to offer alternative explanations for the Scablands. Some argued that the channels had been carved by normal river erosion over vast periods of time, combined with the slow downcutting of Ice Age glaciers. Others suggested that the massive boulders had been moved by floating ice, not by torrential currents. Still others proposed that the entire landscape could be explained by the gradual shifting of drainage patterns over millions of years. Every explanation shared one thing in common. It was gradual, it was slow, and it required no catastrophic flood. When Bretz finally published his response, it was a masterpiece of restrained fury. He addressed each objection methodically, drawing on his years of fieldwork to show why the proposed alternative simply could not account for what he had observed. The channels were not river valleys. They were braided flood paths with no consistent downstream gradient. The giant ripple marks could not be produced by glacial action. They were current bed forms that required immense, deep, fast-moving water. The boulders could not have been transported by ice. Many of them were perched on ridges in positions that only made sense if they had been carried by a massive current and then abruptly dropped. He answered every objection, but he could not overcome the underlying resistance. His colleagues did not reject his theory because the evidence was weak. They rejected it because the conclusion was unacceptable. The years passed. The decade turned. Bretz continued his fieldwork, continued publishing, continued insisting that the evidence pointed toward a flood, and the establishment continued to resist. New alternative explanations were proposed, more elaborate, more convoluted, but always gradual, always avoiding the dreaded C word. The debate settled into a kind of stalemate, with Bretz on one side and virtually everyone else on the other. The personal toll was considerable. Bretz was not ostracized exactly. He kept his position at the University of Chicago, continued to teach, continued to produce careful, respected work in other areas of geology. But there was a chill. Colleagues who had once been friendly grew distant. His flood papers were greeted with silence or polite dismissal. He must have felt at times like he was shouting into a void. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from seeing something clearly, something that no one else is willing to see. It is the loneliness of the prophet, the Cassandra, the person who knows the truth but cannot make others believe. And yet Bretz persisted. He kept returning to the Scablands, kept gathering evidence, kept refining his arguments. He was not a young man anymore. The years were passing, and with them the possibility of vindication. But he could not let it go. The landscape would not let him. Every dry waterfall, every stranded boulder, every giant ripple mark was a witness, and Bretz was determined to make the world hear their testimony. There is a broader lesson here about how science works, or rather about how it sometimes fails to work. We like to imagine science as a purely rational enterprise, a dispassionate search for truth in which evidence always triumphs over prejudice. But science is practiced by human beings, and human beings carry their assumptions, their fears, and their institutional loyalties with them into the laboratory and the field. The resistance to Bretz's flood theory was not a failure of evidence. It was a failure of imagination, a failure of willingness to consider that the Earth might be more dynamic, more violent, and more surprising than the prevailing theories allowed. The geological establishment had constructed a worldview that was elegant, consistent, and deeply comforting in its gradualism. It told a story of a planet changing slowly and predictably, a story in which there were no sudden catastrophes, no world-ending floods, no events too large or too fast to be accommodated within the steady tick of uniformitarian time. Bretz's flood threatened to shatter that story, and the guardians of the story fought back with everything they had. But the Earth does not care about our stories. It does not arrange itself to fit our theories or respect the boundaries of our disciplines. The Scablands were there, carved into the basalt of eastern Washington, testimony to an event that defied everything the geological establishment believed, and they would wait patiently for the world to catch up. The world had to catch up, and the tool that finally forced it to do so was one that J Harlen Bretz could never have imagined when he first tramped across the dusty Scablands in the 1920s. For decades, the greatest obstacle to accepting the flood theory had been one of perspective, quite literally. On the ground, standing at the bottom of a dry waterfall, or walking along a giant ripple mark, the sheer scale of the landscape was almost impossible to comprehend. You could see the pieces, the stranded boulders, the carved channels, the eroded basalt, but it was desperately difficult to see how they all fit together into a single coherent event. It was like trying to understand the shape of an elephant by pressing your nose against its hide. You needed distance, you needed elevation, you needed to see the whole thing at once. That distance arrived with aerial photography. During and after the Second World War, advances in aviation and camera technology made systematic aerial surveys of the American landscape possible for the first time. When geologists finally looked at aerial photographs of the Channeled Scablands, the effect was electrifying. Features that had seemed confusing or ambiguous from the ground suddenly made perfect sense when seen from above. The braided channels that Bretz had mapped painstakingly on foot revealed themselves as unmistakable flood pathways, diverging and reconverging across hundreds of miles of terrain. The dry waterfalls, which had seemed like isolated curiosities when approached on horseback or by car, could now be seen as a chain, a series of enormous plunge pools and spillways carved as the water overtopped one ridge after another. The entire landscape told the same story, but you had to be high enough to read it. And then there were the ripples. Bretz had described the giant current ripples in his early papers, but his descriptions were met with skepticism. Ripple marks, his colleagues pointed out, are small features found on beaches and riverbeds, created by gentle waves or modest currents. The idea that ripples could be large enough to be visible from a moving car, let alone from an airplane, seemed absurd. But the aerial photographs showed something extraordinary. Across the floor of the Scablands, stretching for mile after mile, were immense undulations in the sediment, symmetrical ridges and troughs with wavelengths of hundreds of feet and amplitudes of 30 feet or more. From the air they were unmistakable. They were current ripples, exactly like the ripples you might see on a stream bed after a rain, but scaled up to a size that beggared imagination. These were not glacial features. They were not formed by wind or weathering. They were the physical imprint of an enormous, fast-moving body of water, frozen in sediment at the moment the current slowed and deposited its load. You could almost calculate the depth and velocity of the water from the size of the ripples. The aerial photographs didn't just suggest a flood. They allowed geologists to measure it. The tide of opinion began to shift, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. In 1965, the International Association for Quaternary Research organised a field trip to the Scablands, and this trip became the turning point. A group of prominent geologists, many of whom had been sceptical of Bretz's theories, flew over the region and then walked to the ground with fresh eyes, guided by the insights that aerial photography had provided. One by one, the skeptics found themselves unable to deny what they were seeing. The dry cataracts, the immense gravel bars, the giant ripples, the potholes, the erratics, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. There had been a flood a massive, catastrophic, unimaginably powerful flood. By the end of the trip, the holdouts had largely conceded. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. It was a triumph, but a delayed one. Bretz was by this time an old man, 83 years old, still sharp, but carrying the weight of decades of professional isolation and dismissal. He did not attend the field trip himself, but he received word of its outcome. The news must have been bittersweet. After 40 years of fighting, of insisting, of being told he was wrong, he had been proven right. But 40 years is a long time to carry a truth that no one else will accept. The vindication must have felt less like victory and more like the lifting of an enormous, exhausting burden. Recognition eventually came, as it sometimes does for those who live long enough. In 1979, at the age of 96, Bretz received the Penrose Medal, the highest honour awarded by the Geological Society of America. It was the same institution that had once organised special sessions to dismantle his work. The citation acknowledged his pioneering studies of the Scablands and the glacial theory that had finally, after so many years, been accepted by the scientific community. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but too perfect not to tell, that Bretz's first words upon receiving the medal were, "I've been talked about a lot, but I don't think I've been believed." Whether he actually said this or not, it captures something essential about his long struggle. Acceptance had come, but the scars of rejection remained. The acceptance of the Missoula flood hypothesis did more than vindicate one man. It opened a door that had been closed for over a century. Catastrophism, the idea that sudden violent events could play a significant role in shaping the Earth's surface, was no longer considered unscientific. It was recognized as a valid and necessary part of the geological toolkit. Uniformitarianism did not die. Rather, it was expanded, supplemented, made more nuanced. The Earth, scientists now acknowledged, is shaped by both slow, gradual processes and sudden, catastrophic ones. Both are real. Both leave their marks on the landscape. The dogma of pure gradualism had been broken, not by revolution, but by the patient accumulation of evidence that simply could not be explained any other way. This was Bretz's true legacy, not just the discovery of a flood, but the demonstration that the Earth is capable of events that exceed our comfortable assumptions about what is possible. The Scablands are a monument to that capability, carved into the bedrock of Washington state, visible from the air and from the ground, testimony to a day when the ice dams broke and half a continent drowned beneath waters that should not have been possible. And they are a monument to the man who believed what the land was telling him, even when no one else would listen. But knowing that the floods happened was only part of the puzzle. The question that remained was deceptively simple. If these catastrophic inundations had reshaped half a continent, when exactly did they occur? And how many times did the cycle repeat? For a long time the timeline of the Missoula Floods was frustratingly vague, situated somewhere within the last ice age, a period spanning tens of thousands of years. But geologists needed more precision. They needed a calendar written in the earth itself. And strangely enough, they found it in volcanic ash. Mount St. Helens, the volcano that would much later capture the world's attention in 1980, had been active for millennia before our modern era. Over thousands of years it erupted repeatedly, sending massive plumes of ash billowing into the sky. That ash drifted eastward on the wind, settling over the landscapes of the Pacific Northwest in distinct, recognizable layers. Each eruption produced a slightly different chemical signature, a unique fingerprint of trace elements and mineral composition that allows geologists to identify and match ash deposits across hundreds of miles. These ash layers became invaluable time markers, geological bookmarks embedded in the sediment. When researchers began carefully excavating the deep layers of flood sediment, the rhythmic deposits of silt, clay and gravel laid down by the receding waters, they found these ash layers sandwiched between them. Imagine slicing into a layered cake and finding a thin, distinct stripe of red jam. That jam layer tells you exactly where you are in the sequence. If you find Mount St. Helens ash below a flood deposit, you know that flood happened after that specific eruption. If you find ash resting on top of flood sediment, you know the flood occurred before it. And if you find ash nestled within a sequence of multiple flood layers, it divides the timeline, separating older floods from younger ones. These ash horizons gave researchers an anchor, but they needed more lines of evidence to build a complete chronology. They turned to the painstaking work of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and layering. By tracing individual floodbeds across the Scablands, the Columbia River Gorge, and the Willamette Valley, geologists could see the repetition clearly. Each flood left its own layer, separated by thin bands of soil or wind-blown loess that represented the quiet centuries in between, times when the land lay still and sparse vegetation tried to take hold. Counting these layers, measuring their thickness, noting where they thinned out or thickened, allowed researchers to estimate just how many times the ice dam had formed and failed. Radiocarbon dating provided another crucial tool, though it came with its own limitations. Organic material, bits of wood, plant remains, shells, could be found occasionally within or between flood deposits. When a flood tore across the landscape, it ripped up trees and vegetation, incorporating them into the chaotic jumble of debris it carried. By extracting whatever organic material survived and measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes within it, scientists could determine the approximate age of the flood that had buried it. But radiocarbon dating has a finite reach. It becomes unreliable beyond about 50,000 years, meaning it could only illuminate the later floods in the sequence. For the earlier ones, researchers had to rely more heavily on the ash layers and the relative positions of the sediment beds. So what does all this evidence tell us about the timeline? The floods occurred during the last ice age, specifically during a period called the Wisconsin Glaciation. The ice sheets began advancing roughly 75,000 years ago, and it was during the latter part of this deep freeze, roughly between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, that the floods appear to have been most frequent. As the climate warmed and the great glaciers began their final retreat, the conditions that created Glacial Lake Missoula eventually vanished, and the cycle of damming and catastrophic draining came to an end. But pinning down exact dates for individual floods remains a challenge, and here is where the scientific debate grows lively. Different researchers looking at different pieces of evidence have proposed different chronologies. Some argue for as many as 40 or more separate flood events scattered across several thousand years. Others suggest a smaller number of truly massive floods, with some of the sediment layers representing multiple pulses of water from a single complex event rather than entirely separate occurrences. The Earth is not a perfectly orderly archive. Floods eroded the evidence of previous floods. A later, slightly smaller inundation could wash away the delicate surface layers left by an earlier one, leaving an incomplete record. The further back in time you go, the more fragmentary the story becomes. This uncertain timeline raises a tantalizing question about human presence in North America. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were living on the continent by at least 15,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. Did any of these early inhabitants witness the Missoula Floods? The chronological overlap is possible, though uncertain. Some of the later floods might have occurred when small bands of hunter-gatherers were already exploring the regions downstream of the ice dam. Imagine standing on a hillside in what is now eastern Washington, watching the horizon darken with a wall of water and sediment, feeling the ground tremble beneath your feet as a torrent the likes of which no human had ever seen roared across the plain below. It is a haunting image, though one we cannot confirm. The evidence, both geological and archaeological, remains too sparse, too ambiguous to say with any certainty whether people and floods coexisted in those ancient landscapes. What we can say with growing confidence is that the floods were not a single aberration. The ash layers, the stratigraphy, the radiocarbon dates all point to the same conclusion that J Harlen Bretz himself eventually reached. The ice dam formed, the lake filled, the dam failed, and the water rushed forth. Then the ice advanced again, the dam reformed, the lake refilled, and the cycle repeated, perhaps dozens of times over the span of several millennia. Each flood was a discrete event, separated by centuries or even thousands of years of relative calm, but all part of the same grand, violent rhythm imposed by the advancing and retreating ice. The dating of the floods also connects this story to a much larger global pattern. The last ice age was not a uniform deep freeze. It was punctuated by episodes of slight warming and dramatic cooling, fluctuations that advanced and retreated the ice sheets. Each time the ice pushed forward far enough to block the Clark Fork River, it set the stage for another inundation. Each time the climate shifted, the stage was reset. The floods were not random. They were a consequence of climate dynamics operating on a continental scale, a pace of change that feels almost rhythmic, almost predictable in hindsight, even if the precise timing of each individual event remains hidden in the fragmented layers of the past. The recognition that the Missoula floods were not a one-time aberration but part of a repeating climatic rhythm opened a profound shift in how geologists understood the power of ice. If the advancing and retreating glaciers of North America could dam massive lakes and release them in apocalyptic torrents, could the same thing have happened elsewhere? The answer, it turns out, is written in the landscapes of other continents, echoing the Scablands half a world away. The story of Glacial Lake Missoula is spectacular, but it is not alone. To understand these events, it helps to look at a phenomenon that still happens today, albeit on a vastly smaller scale. In Iceland, there is a word for the sudden release of water from beneath a glacier: jökullaup. It translates simply to a glacial lake outburst flood, but the word carries the weight of centuries of observation. Iceland sits atop a volcanic hotspot, and its glaciers frequently cover active volcanoes. When an eruption melts the ice from below, vast lakes can form beneath the glacier, trapped under hundreds of feet of ice. Eventually, the water pressure lifts the glacier slightly, or the ice simply gives way, and the water rushes out in a spectacular, violent flood. Modern jökullaups can tear up roads, sweep away bridges, and reshape entire valleys in a matter of hours. They are terrifying, but compared to the Missoula floods, they are mere ripples. An Icelandic jökullaup might discharge a few thousand cubic meters of water per second. The Missoula floods discharged millions, but the mechanics are essentially the same. Ice dams the water, pressure builds, the dam fails, and the land is remade. Understanding this process and recognizing the fingerprints it leaves on the landscape allowed scientists to look at other ancient landscapes with fresh eyes. Long before Bretz had been vindicated, geologists in other parts of the world had puzzled over features that didn't seem to fit the slow, gradual erosion they had been taught to expect. Once the Missoula floods were accepted, those features suddenly made sense. The Scablands of eastern Washington became a kind of Rosetta Stone for catastrophic flooding, a template that geologists could use to identify similar events elsewhere. And they found them. In Siberia, for instance, there is evidence of megafloods that may have been even larger than those in North America. During the last ice age, massive ice sheets blocked the flow of rivers draining into the Arctic Ocean, creating enormous glacial lakes. One of these, Glacial Lake Missoula, covered a vast area of what is now western Siberia. When its ice dam failed, the resulting flood sent unimaginable volumes of water surging across the landscape, carving deep channels and depositing immense fields of gravel and boulders. Another, Glacial Lake Komi in northern Russia, left similar scars. These floods reshaped the drainage patterns of entire river systems, altering how water flows across that part of the planet to this day. In Central Asia, the Altai Mountains hold evidence of another series of catastrophic floods. Glacial Lake Kure-Chuja, dammed by ice in the high valleys, left behind what might be the most dramatic evidence of ancient megafloods anywhere on Earth. Giant current ripples, similar to those found in the Scablands but sometimes even larger, cover the valley floors. Measuring these ripples and using the same hydraulic equations developed to understand the Missoula Floods, researchers have estimated that the Altai floods may have involved discharges of water so immense they challenge comprehension. Entire mountain valleys were scoured clean, and massive boulders were transported for miles. Even the English Channel, the narrow strip of water separating Britain from mainland Europe, may owe its existence to a megaflood. The theory, supported by sonar imaging of the channel floor, suggests that during a previous ice age, a glacial lake formed in what is now the North Sea, dammed by ice to the north and a land bridge to the south. When that land bridge, made of chalk and other soft rock, failed, the lake drained catastrophically, carving the deep valley that now lies beneath the channel's waters. If this theory is correct, then the very geography of modern Europe was shaped by the same forces that created the Scablands. What do all these comparisons reveal? They show that Ice Age megafloods were not anomalies. They were a fundamental part of how the planet responded to the advance and retreat of glaciers. Whenever and wherever ice sheets grew large enough to block drainage, they created the potential for catastrophic flooding. The dynamics are surprisingly consistent, whether you're looking at the Channeled Scablands, the valleys of Siberia, or the mountains of Central Asia. Ice dams form, lakes fill, pressure builds, dams fail. Water rushes forth with almost inconceivable force, eroding channels, transporting sediment, and leaving behind landscapes that puzzle observers for centuries. The same sequence, the same physics, the same devastating power. Studying the Missoula Floods helped scientists recognize these patterns because it provided a clear, well-documented example of what a glacial lake outburst flood looks like at its most extreme. The Scablands became a reference point, a place where the evidence was so dramatic and so well preserved that it could not be ignored. Once geologists knew what to look for, they began finding similar features all over the world, sometimes in places that had been mapped for decades without anyone recognizing the catastrophic origins of the landscape. But here's what makes the Missoula Floods truly unique, even among this global catalogue of destruction: their repetition. Most other megafloods appear to have been single events, or perhaps a handful of occurrences. A lake forms, it drains, and the story ends. But in the Pacific Northwest, the ice dam reformed again and again. The cycle repeated, perhaps dozens of times, over thousands of years. Each flood built upon the work of the last, deepening channels, widening coulees, stacking sediment layers like pages in a book. This repetition is what makes the Scablands so extensive, so deeply carved, so unmistakably the product of catastrophic flooding. A single megaflood would have left impressive scars. Dozens of megafloods, following the same pathways over millennia, created a landscape that defies ordinary explanation. Today, the Channeled Scablands stand as one of the most striking natural landmarks on the planet, a vast open-air museum of catastrophic geology. If you walk through eastern Washington now, the scars of the Ice Age are impossible to ignore, etched into every hillside and carved into every valley. What was once a confusing puzzle of barren rock and deep channels is now recognized and celebrated, mapped by geologists, and explored by curious travellers from around the world. The dry coulees, the towering basalt cliffs, the stranded waterfalls. They have all been given names, and their stories are told on interpretive signs and in visitor centres. Places like Dry Falls, where a waterfall 5 times wider than Niagara now stands silent and dry, draw people who want to stand at the edge of something immense and imagine the impossible volumes of water that once thundered over that precipice. Palouse Falls, the only major waterfall on the Scablands that still carries water today, drops nearly 200 feet into a plunging pool, a living reminder of the immense erosive power that carved the surrounding canyons. Tourists hike the trails, photographers chase the light across the rippled basalt, and geology students kneel in the dry dust with their hand lenses, reading the ancient history written in the stone. The Scablands have become a destination, a place where the reality of deep time and sudden violent change is tangible, almost visceral. You can reach out and touch the rock that was polished by a wall of water moving faster than a speeding car. You can stand in a dry canyon 1,000 feet wide and try to fill that empty space with the roar of a flood that happened over 15,000 years ago. It is a landscape that teaches by simply existing. And it teaches not just about the past, but about how we understand the Earth itself. The story of the Scablands, from Bretz's lonely advocacy to his eventual vindication, reshaped the scientific method in geology in a profound way. For over a century, the discipline had been governed by the principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that the slow, gradual processes we observe today, the steady erosion of rivers, the incremental deposition of sediment, the patient drift of continents, are the only forces that shape the planet. Catastrophism, the notion that sudden, violent events could alter the course of Earth's history, had been dismissed as archaic, a relic of older, less scientific ways of thinking. But the Missoula Floods forced a reconsideration. They demonstrated unequivocally that while gradual processes are indeed the dominant force in Earth's history, they are not the only force. Sometimes, very rarely, the planet undergoes events of almost inconceivable violence, events that can reshape entire regions in a matter of days. The acceptance of the Scablands as the product of megafloods opened the door for the recognition of other catastrophic events, from the impact that killed the dinosaurs to the massive volcanic eruptions that have triggered mass extinctions. It didn't replace uniformitarianism, but it added a crucial amendment. Sometimes the Earth changes slowly, and sometimes it changes in an instant. The Scablands became the proof that both truths can coexist. There is a broader lesson here, one that extends beyond geology and touches on how we understand the world around us. The story of the Missoula Floods is, at its heart, a story about humility. For decades, the scientific establishment looked at the Scablands and saw what they expected to see, the work of slow, ordinary processes. They dismissed the evidence for catastrophe, because catastrophe didn't fit their framework. Bretz had to fight for decades, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the evidence told a story that people weren't ready to hear. And this is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of science. We interpret the world through the lens of our assumptions, and when the world presents us with something that doesn't fit, our first instinct is often to explain it away, rather than to reconsider our assumptions. The Scablands remind us that the Earth is under no obligation to make sense to us, that its history is longer and stranger and more violent than we can easily imagine, and that the truth is often more astonishing than the stories we tell ourselves. It is a reminder to approach the unknown with curiosity rather than certainty, to let the evidence lead us, even when it leads us somewhere unexpected. And the legacy of the floods is not just written in stone and scientific theory. It is written in the living landscape of the Pacific Northwest, in the rivers that flow and the soils that sustain agriculture. The same floodwaters that carved the Scablands also carried with them enormous quantities of sediment, silt and clay, which they deposited across a wide area as the waters slowed and spread out. In the Willamette Valley of Oregon, those deposits, layers of rich, fertile sediment carried from the scoured plains of Montana and Washington, created some of the most productive agricultural land in North America. The vineyards and orchards and fields of the Willamette Valley are growing in soil that was delivered by a megaflood, a catastrophic event that scoured one region and enriched another. The rivers themselves, the Columbia, the Snake, the Willamette, still follow paths that were deepened and widened by the floodwaters. The modern geography of the region, the location of cities, the routes of highways, the very shape of the land bears the imprint of those ancient floods. The water that pours from taps in Portland, the ships that navigate the Columbia River Gorge, the fertile fields that feed millions, all of it is connected by an unbroken thread to the day the ice dams broke. A single event, repeated over millennia, didn't just redraw the map. It laid the foundation for the world that exists today. As we look back on this story, from the slow accumulation of ice to the sudden catastrophic release of water, from the lonely advocacy of J Harlen Bretz to the global recognition of megafloods, we are left with something that feels almost paradoxical. The floods were events of unimaginable destruction, capable of obliterating everything in their path, moving mountains of rock, and reshaping the continent. And yet, out of that destruction came something new. A landscape of stark and surprising beauty. A scientific revolution that changed how we understand the Earth. A fertile valley that feeds countless people. The Scablands today are not just a record of catastrophe. They are a record of transformation, of how the most violent forces can, over time, become the foundation for new growth and new understanding. The floodwaters have long since receded. The ice dams are gone. The lakes have drained, but the legacy endures, carved into the bedrock of a continent and woven into the fabric of a region that still lives in the shadow of the greatest floods the Earth has ever known. So we return to where we began, to that impossible moment when a wall of ice gave way and an inland sea rushed toward the Pacific. Think about the journey those floodwaters took. It started with snow, individual flakes falling silently on the frozen peaks of the northern Rockies, accumulating season after season, compressing into glacial ice that slowly crept down mountain valleys. That ice plugged a crucial drainage point, and behind it the meltwater gathered, rising inch by inch, year by year, forming Glacial Lake Missoula. Then the pressure became too great. The dam floated. And in a matter of hours, a volume of water measuring hundreds of cubic miles surged across the continent. It ripped across eastern Washington, carving the Channeled Scablands in days, leaving behind dry waterfalls and canyons that dwarf anything carved by gradual erosion. It thundered through the Columbia River Gorge, stripping soil from the valley walls, leaving massive boulders stranded on hillsides. It backed up into Oregon's Willamette Valley, dropping layers of fertile silt before finally emptying into the Pacific, depositing its sediment on the deep ocean floor. And then the ice advanced again. The dam reformed, the lake refilled, and the cycle repeated, perhaps as many as 40 times or more. Each flood reinforced the scars of the last deepening channels, moving boulders, reshaping half a continent. It is a staggering cascade of cause and effect, stretching from the subtle accumulation of snowflakes to a continental-scale transformation that is still visible today. But the legacy of the Missoula Floods isn't just written in the basalt and the soil. It is also written in the history of how we came to understand them. Think about J Harlen Bretz, standing alone in those barren coulees in the 1920s, looking at a landscape that seemed to defy everything his colleagues believed about how the Earth works. He saw catastrophe where others saw only time. He saw sudden, violent change where the scientific establishment insisted on slow, incremental progress. And for decades, he was ridiculed for it. He was dismissed as a relic, as someone who had abandoned rigorous science for a modern-day flood myth. But Bretz had something that his critics did not have. He had the rocks. He had the evidence. He had the giant ripples and the stranded boulders and the dry waterfalls that simply could not be explained by any gradual process. And slowly, piece by piece, as aerial photography revealed the true scale of the Scablands from above, as new mapping techniques exposed the undeniable patterns of massive water flow, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The establishment had to yield. The paradigm shifted. It is a profound thing to consider that it took nearly half a century for the truth of the Missoula Floods to be accepted. Not because the evidence was lacking, but because the truth was too big, too strange, too violent to fit comfortably into the frameworks that people had built for understanding the world. And that brings us to the deepest lesson of this story, a lesson that extends far beyond the boundaries of geology. Nature is not always slow. The earth is not always patient. For vast stretches of time, things do change gradually, grain by grain, layer by layer. But sometimes, rarely, with terrifying suddenness, everything changes all at once. An ice dam breaks. A wall of water hundreds of feet high surges across the landscape. A region the size of a small country is redrawn in a matter of days. We tend to think of the world as stable, as fundamentally predictable. The Missoula Floods remind us that it is not. They remind us that the earth has a capacity for sudden, dramatic change that defies our expectations and challenges our assumptions. The ground beneath our feet holds a record of events that seem impossible. Events that happened in the blink of a geological eye and left scars that will endure until the planet itself is gone. As you drift towards sleep tonight, hold that thought gently in your mind. The immensity of deep time, the strange and violent history hidden in the rocks, the quiet persistence of water and ice. The floodwaters have long since receded, but their story remains, carved into the very bones of the land. If you found this journey into the deep past soothing and intriguing, I would be incredibly grateful if you could take a brief moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you know, and I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your location in the comments below. Are you near the Scablands yourself, or halfway across the world? It is always wonderful to imagine this community of curious minds resting in so many different places. If you want to explore more prehistoric secrets and lost worlds, you can find our book available at sleepytimehistory.com. It is full of stories just like this one, waiting to accompany you into the quiet hours of the night. For now, let your thoughts drift like the slow, gentle settling of silt in a calm and quiet lake. The floods are over. The land is still. Rest well, and good night.